I just graduated from medical school, and my new hospital has some very strange rules. You probably think that all doctors are immensely affluent, like I did in the beginning. 8 years in a clutch of premature gray hairs later, I'm only a few $100,000 poorer than broke. That would be important if I had a family to support, but the grueling hours in medical school have ended my previous relationship and reduced the shelf life of my ovaries. I was in a take what you can get and be grateful situation. So when St. Francis Hospital in Charleston, West Virginia offered me a position, I packed my miserable life into 3 bags and sought opportunity in the Appalachian Highlands. 19 of us began in July and 13 have already quit out. I prefer to think of myself as the rat that refused to drown. Some others broke down on the inside after witnessing children die because they were not yet qualified to be doctors. It's especially difficult when you have to inform the deceased child's parents, who then beg you to tell them other news or scream that they want to die and that you should kill them with whatever substance relieves their anguish. But the majority of my incoming class couldn't handle the chief of medicine. Dr. Vivian Scrit is without a doubt the biggest bitch I have ever met. Now I see why. 19 of you start today, and we've got a pool going with bets on how long each of you will last, she said when we arrived. Don't feel any pressure, everyone. I've spoken with every one of you privately, and my expectations are quite low. She snorted and walked away after peering condescendingly over her narrow spectacles. You should know when to follow me and when to stay away, because I'm not going to waste time explaining what you should figure out on your own. We looked at one another, feeling weak and little, and then scampered after her. I was the last in line and felt out of place taking even that amount. You should have the list of expectations for St. Francis, Dr. Scrit said as she walked away, not looking at us. I printed 18 sets of rules so that you would have to challenge one another for them, knowing that one of you would be left behind. An icy feeling developed in the pit of my stomach as I saw everyone look down at a list of regulations that only I lacked. If you do not follow these regulations, there will be no place for you in this hospital. It is very likely that you are not qualified to be a doctor and should pursue a career that requires less mental aptitude. She turned around and faced us all. And if you think that I'm the type to give second chances after a mistake, you're woefully underprepared for the world of medicine. She paused and stared at each of us in turn, as if awaiting an answer that no one dared to provide. Well, she exclaimed in frustration, why are you standing here? People are dying. Get to work. Nobody wanted to show me their set of rules, so I had to wait until one of my classmates died. It took about a week. I was working at 3 o'clock a.m. because I had only been on the clock for 10 hours. I was running into another room so a patient wouldn't know I was Googling his symptoms. Doctors do this far more than you realize. When I noticed Myron alone in an operating room, I instantly came to a stop. Myron? I squeaked. What the hell is that? His arms were working furiously, but his back was to me, so I couldn't see what he was doing. Something felt odd. Myron was the pick of the litter. He had been in the top 10 of his class at Johns Hopkins, and he would remind us of this in exchange for answering questions we were too afraid to approach Dr. Scrit. I approached Myron cautiously, not wanting to shock him. We're really busy right now. Is there something you need help with? He gave no outward indication that he had heard me. Instead, he continued to pump relentlessly at the task at hand. When I was 5 steps away, I noticed drops of blood flying over his shoulder. This made no sense, given that he had been alone in the room. Myron, I said softly, scarcely audible to myself. I crept around his left side, eventually bringing the sight into full view. Myron's abdomen was divided from sternum to pelvis. His esophagus protruded and his stomach rested on the table. A nest of quivering tiny intestines led from the bottom of his stomach back into his mangled torso. Myron displayed no apparent signs of suffering. He was too busy working. He grabbed his stomach fiercely with his left palm, the folds squirting between his fingers like unbaked bread. His right hand was working furiously with a scalpel, cutting his organs into shreds. The intensity of his endeavor caused rivers of sweat to flow down his forehead. I attempted to shout, but it just came out as a moan. That was enough to make Myron notice me. Slowly, he lifted his head. Slowly, he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. With his gaze fixed on me, he moistened his lips before angrily stabbing a piece of his stomach and lifting it to his mouth. He bit, he chewed. Then he lunged. However, most people don't know how to move with their insides exposed for all to see, which was his undoing. Myron's tattered guts caught on the table's corner, causing him to fall to the floor. Finally, he yelled. I realized very early in my medical profession that compartmentalization is critical. That instinct took over my thinking in the moment, and I behaved clinically. Myron was still holding his scalpel in his right hand. I kicked it hard, and it flew right out of his hands. He looked at me and screeched. With his entrails still wrapped around the table, I felt the best course of action was to retreat. As a doctor and janitor entered the room, I moved to the back, and in maybe the most stunning moment of the night, I realized they weren't surprised. Myron was sedated, subdued, and extracted within a minute of their arrival. For a time, I was alone with a pool of blood and a shredded stomach lining. And something else. A sheet of paper lay on the floor, its corner brushing against the edge of the crawling blood. Myron had dropped his list of rules. The practical side of my intellect kept me going. I grabbed the paper off the ground and swiftly fled the room, taking care to avoid the puddle. I didn't want to leave any gory footsteps in my wake. I knew I needed to read the list as soon as I could get 30 uninterrupted seconds to myself. 3 hours later, I had my opportunity and slipped into a janitor's closet. With a shaking, fatigued hand, I pulled the cord on a bare bulb, attempted to ignore the terrible odor of dripping ammonia, and began reading. St. Francis Hospital Rules, Guidelines for New Doctors. 1. Under no circumstances may you share a copy of the rules with anyone. 2. If another doctor exhibits unusual behavior, leave the area immediately. Don't make eye contact. 3. If another doctor is approached or detained by someone wearing a janitor's uniform, do not intervene. Never ask about that ex-doctor again. 4. Never handle any seemingly abandoned Reese's peanut butter cups. These are Dr. Scrit's favorite candies. 5. Any child who dies at St. Francis Hospital must be cremated within 120 minutes of the official time of death. If you feel this rule has been broken, please notify Dr. Scrit, and the hospital will be evacuated. 6. There is no children's burn unit at St. Francis Hospital. If you find yourself there, keep going until you get back to familiar territory. This normally involves 47 minutes of moving in a straight line down the central hallway. You will not encounter a wall throughout that time. 7. This rule is only for those who need to know it. 8. A little amount of sulfuric acid is stored in each room. This is only meant for patients with severed spinal cords. If they attack, the only method to stop them is to administer a hypodermic injection of H2SO4 into the cranium. 9. The morgue must always have at least 13 cadavers. 10. If you find yourself on the hospital roof with no idea how you got there, you have just 2 options. Either wait for an extraction team to locate you or jump 4 stories to the sidewalk on Court Street. 11. If you notice room 1913, do not stare at the numbers. Don't open the door. This is, by far, the most significant rule. My heart stopped when the door opened. Dr. Scret stared at me. What little emotion she displayed appeared to be astonishment. We both stood still for 5 seconds of agonizing quiet. "Dr. Raphaelis," she said solemnly, "I'm shocked." She looked down at the blood-stained list of regulations in my grasp. I yearned for words, any words, because practically any response would make me appear less guilty than I did in that moment, staring up at my boss's boss's boss and saying nothing in my defense while she weighed my soul with her eyes. I said nothing. "You took a list that wasn't yours and were nowhere to be found after your coworker experienced such an unnatural incident." Dr. Scrit huffed through her nose. "It appears like you're willing to go to extreme lengths to obtain what you need. And Myron couldn't even obey the most fundamental rule." She clenched her teeth. "I had a 4-year trend of guessing which incoming doctors would break the most quickly. This will ruin my chances in the office pool." Before turning to depart, she smiled briefly. "Go to work, doctor. You have 3 hours left on your shift, and those symptoms aren't going to Google themselves." I hadn't realized I was holding my breath until I heard my own gasp for air. Shaking, I carefully emerged from the janitor's closet. I quickly slipped the list of regulations back into my pocket, focusing on the fact that I had just achieved what could be termed a legitimate victory. Perhaps, just maybe, I can keep my head above water at St. Francis after all. I had just turned to walk down the corridor when I came to a halt. Everything was unfamiliar. What the hell happened? I looked around. The hallway's design looked familiar, but everything seemed strange. I could hear people conversing in the rooms, but there were no other individuals in my immediate neighborhood. Nothing made sense. Then I looked up. And to be honest, I peed a little when I read the sign. St. Francis Hospital, Children's Burn Unit. Have you ever gone down a hallway and everyone knew you didn't belong? Consider what it would be like to go through that at work. As I walked along the central corridor of St. Francis Hospital's Children's Burn Unit, I kept my head down and my ears up. This hospital does not have a children's burn unit, even though I passed a sign that boldly stated that it had been donated by the Friends of Crespwell Academy for Superb Children. Nope. This site did not exist. I'd been working at St. Francis since July, and I knew every inch of it. Maybe I missed a wing, right? But after a few minutes of advancing in a straight line, I realized it was nonsense. I didn't turn any corners or encounter any walls. If a half-mile hallway had existed, I would have noticed it. People seemed odd as well. As I passed, a heavy-set nurse with frizzy hair looked at me with distrust. I ran into her 3 times in the same corridor, despite the fact that she could not have moved ahead of me. Another nurse, fragile and anxious, attempted to deliver me a bag of blood. When I refused, she hurled it violently on the ground, where it splattered. I continued going without looking back. My list of rules said unequivocally that if I found myself in this impossible situation, I must continue in a straight line for 47 minutes. I looked down at my watch. It was 3:09 a.m., 6 minutes after I'd arrived in this terrible corner of hell. The employees were more persistent as I continued on. "Doctor," shouted a resident as he rushed out of a room, "the patient is coding. We need you now." As I passed past him, I was careful not to make eye contact. "Doctor," he yelled, "you're killing her." I wiped away a tear as I moved ahead, ignoring the horrific scream from the room. I'd heard enough patients to recognize a dying howl, but I didn't have a choice. A minute later, I discovered a puddle of standing blood. It spanned across both hallway walls and stretched 20 feet in front of me. As I watched, I noticed it increasing. A surly-looking man in a janitor's uniform stood nearby, arms crossed, peering at me. I didn't think he was a janitor. Without pausing, I plodded through the blood. Squish, squish, squish. Damn. This was my favorite pair of Crocs. I entered a clear section of the hallway and checked my watch. It was 3:22. I had been walking for 19 minutes, 13 more than the last time I looked. The sudden silence was more unsettling than the blood. Then, slowly, I sensed tension building in the air. Imagine a strange man standing 2 inches behind you, his breath warming the back of your neck, but you can't see him. That kind of anxiety emanated from the room ahead. The door slowly came into view. I saw the numbers 191 before closing my eyes. I kept them shut as I passed past. As I walked past the entrance, vertigo nearly knocked me over. I didn't mind the possibility of walking into a wall. I closed my eyes for a long time after that. Fortunately, I did not hit anything. When I eventually opened them again, the time was 3:27. 24 minutes to go. That was when the hand tugged on my back. "Can you please help me?" squeaked a scared voice from behind. I paused, walking. I evaluated my alternatives. Then I moved forward. "Wait," he exclaimed. "Please, I'm really hurt and I need your help." He grabbed my shirt again and began crying. I wiped my eyes and moved on. The biggest trials cause us to grow. However, that feat is accomplished by causing a small part of ourselves to die. Children only have the energy and desire to play outside because the world has not yet collected its just reward. I knew I had to follow the rules, but doing so killed a small part of my soul. I became a doctor because I believed I could devote my entire life to a cause and still get out of bed every day with a sense of purpose. But as I listened to the youngster walk after me, weeping loudly and begging for aid, I understood that a part of me would never leave that God-forsaken burn unit. I passed the heavy-set nurse again. Her eyes widened when she noticed the boy. "Doctor!" she yelled. "You need to help that child." I moved away without acknowledging her. "Doctor!" she yelled. "What is wrong with you?" I ignored her in the same manner that I dismissed the nurses, doctors, and patients who stared at the youngster in my wake. No matter what they said, I pretended not to hear them as I pushed forward. What happened to him? Him? What happened to her? Why would anyone ignore a child in that situation? Should we help him? No, the boy is her responsibility. Even though I cleaned my face several times, the tears would not stop. I passed a doctor and another janitor. I recognized them as the ones who had taken Myron from the OR. They looked, arms folded, scrutinizing me as I passed by. "Figures," the doctor said to the silent janitor. "She wasn't there for her little brother either." I broke. I let my body double over and wept out. Deep, ugly cries erupted from my diaphragm, convulsing my body as my mind teetered on edge. But I did not stop walking. Doctors may compartmentalize when dealing with life or death situations, and my survival depended on regular mobility. As I wept, the youngster gripped my shirt and we walked together. For 3 kilometers, I was subjected to the most unusual ordeal of my life. An abrupt change in the acoustics caused me to check my watch. 3:51 a.m., 47 minutes had elapsed. I gave one last heaving sob. Then I paused and looked around. I was in familiar territory. Lydia, a nurse from this realm, was the first nice face I encountered. I wanted to give her a bear hug and scream with happiness. She looked at me, her face distorted with fear. "What the fuck is that thing behind you?" My body temperature plummeted by 5 degrees when I felt a familiar tug on my shirt. I froze. Panicked footsteps rushed towards me. I looked in their direction rather than behind me. Dr. Skrit was at full speed. "Dr. Aphelis!" she yelled. She was the epitome of a bitch, yet in that moment I wanted to see her more than anyone else on the planet. "It's been 47 minutes, I exclaimed, shaking my head. "Should I look at it?" Dr. Skrit paused a few feet away from me. She gave a grave nod. I gulped and carefully turned around. I persuaded myself that nothing is ever as horrible as we imagine. since reality follows principles that imagination does not. I was mistaken. Imagine a pizza without cheese. A lumpy mess of marinara is sporadically punctuated by bits of sizzling meat resting above a mountain of globby, yeasty dough. Assume that the pizza is a child with one eyeball hanging from an empty socket, and the child has no hair because all of the skin on his scalp has vanished, as well as a gaping hole where a nose formerly existed. "Help me," he whispered. "Help!" His jaw dropped to the floor, spreading teeth in all directions. The boy's tongue hung from his open throat, flapping aimlessly like a dead fish. Then he clutched my arm in a vice-like grip, screamed, and collapsed to the ground. I stared down at the lifeless mass of flesh that had once been a child. "Dr. Skrit," I whispered, "is he—" "Don't be an idiot, Dr. Aphelis. He was dead long before you brought him here." I looked at her with a sudden insight. "Like more than 120 minutes before?" "Did your inane chatter suddenly achieve the ability to carry a body to the morgue, Dr. Aphelis?" she inquired, leaning over the corpse. I'll find a gurney." As she hoisted the boy's shoulders, she screamed, "No one signs up to be a doctor because she's afraid of getting blood on her manicure. Grab the damn legs and hope his body is more structurally sound than Jell-O. This cadaver will not walk itself to the crematorium." Dazed, I bent down and grabbed the boy's ankles. My stomach churned as I gripped his skin, which moved like grilled chicken meat. Compartmentalize. Lydia held the door open for us as we carried the boy down the stairs, into the morgue, and into a spot where I'd never gone before. I knew the incinerator was there, but I hadn't had any cause to use it. "It's too small to fit his body inside," I said, gasping for breath. Dr. Skrit was plainly in great shape. She had almost run across the morgue, while I had strained to keep up while hauling the body. "What can we—" she grunted as she grabbed the corpse from me and pushed his feet into the incinerator. "If you're going to boring me to death with silly banter, Dr. Aphelis, hurry up and make sure I die before the 120-minute mark. That or fucking help me." It's remarkable what we can do when an imposing individual tells us we have no option. We pushed the boy's body side by side into the incinerator's small aperture. When he became trapped, we simply pushed harder. We both groaned with exertion as his scorched, melting flesh sloughed away like the skin of a rotting peach. Lumps of meat fell to the floor as we peeled layers off the youngster. But he was going inside. We were pushing his shoulders through when his eye sprang up. Doctors see things that will make your skin crawl. Sometimes it is literal shit. Sometimes the skin crawls, but melt is a better descriptor for what necrotizing fasciitis causes. But no textbook could have prepared me for the moment when I stood shoulder to shoulder with the chief of medicine, shoving the decaying body of a burnt child into the incineration chamber, while his one functional eye looked out at us in bitter judgment. He was stuck in the tiny door at the shoulders, with only his head protruding into the room with us. His jaw had long since come off, and the decaying tongue swirled above his inverted face like an enchanted snake. "Dr. Skrit," I asked in a quavering voice, "what are we supposed to do? We're obliged by primum non nocere, therefore don't we have to—" "You're bound to help the living, Dr. Aphelis, which includes me and possibly yourself, if you help me out right fucking now." She grumbled and moved her hands to the top of the boy's head. As she pressed, his entire scalp slipped off like a flaky scab peeled from a wounded limb. A fresh, clean white skull shone from behind the boy's shredded skin, which fell to the floor like ground meat. They are easier to grasp without the skin. Press down on its head. She then pushed his tongue away like an unpleasant insect and pressed hard into his shoulders. Her fingers sank into his flesh like a boot in deep muck. Dazed, I pressed against the boy's exposed bone. I was astounded to realize how cold it was and how it twitched as he futilely attempted to bite me with a jaw that didn't exist. I hate to spoil the finish of this narrative, but you'll be astonished what this thing can achieve in about 10 seconds if you keep fondling it with the restrained passion intended for jerking off an octogenarian. "Push!" she shouted, leaning forward. The body moved into the incinerator with the soft resistance of a bowel movement. Once inside, the boy shouted. Dr. Scrit aggressively threw me aside, put a padlock in place, and cranked the dial. I stared back at her, shocked. She was a bitch, for sure, but she had never touched me before. However, I was a first-year intern. The chief of medicine could basically force me to consume pus and call it ice cream. "Dr. Scrit of War," I questioned hesitantly, "why did you put a padlock on the incinerator?" The screams from beyond the lock were audible enough to shake the floor. "Turn it on," she gave me an instruction. "Where are the—" She shoved me away again, clutching furiously at a sequence of buttons behind me. "Dr. Scrit," I yelled in response to the shove, "why are you—" Slam, slam. The padlock bounced as the incinerator door was struck from the inside. Even though the temperature increased substantially, a chill fell over my body. "This is a custom incinerator," Dr. Scrit stated, pulling my arm away from the entrance. "It will heat up very quickly, so stand—" Slam, 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 slam. The banging from within the incinerator became more intense. I wondered if the padlock would hold. It flailed violently back and forth in time to the rhythmic hitting. Crunch. "It's at 200 degrees, Dr. Scrit called as she peered at the gauge. "We needed to get to 2,000. My head swam. Most medical incinerators can't even get that hot. Crunch. Dr. Scrit turned to face me. "You're right, most can't." She cast a glance back. 500 degrees. I stared at her. "Is it really heating that quickly?" She showed no emotion in her response. "Can't you feel the change in the room?" For the first time, I realized I was perspiring profusely. "How am I so hot?" "We're standing 15 feet away." "So we'd better back up," she said. 1,100 degrees. Slam. A little screw fell to the floor and rolled away, making a gentle tinkling. "Dr. Scrit," I said gently, "I know you're sorry that it took so long to get the boy here." She paused. "We're all sorry." Crack. "Dr. Scrit, the door to the incinerator." 1,500 degrees. A surge of heat drew fresh sweat from every pore. "I don't know if it will hold." Crack. 1,700 degrees. "The padlock is bending. The metal will melt." "That's why we keep hundreds of padlocks in reserve." Slam, crunch, crack. We both stopped breathing. A hand-shaped indentation had crashed into the metal, twisting it from the inside and producing an almost impossible impression. We waited. 1,913 degrees. We waited longer. Nothing occurred. Sweat irritated my eyes so much that I could not see. When I wiped it away, I discovered that my arm was even saltier, exacerbating the discomfort. "I think," Dr. Scrit said in a voice barely audible, "that I stopped it." I gazed through the shimmering heat waves emanating from the incinerator. Lumps of shaved flesh lay on the ground nearby. The aroma of roasted carrion floated through the air, softly tickling my gag reflex. I let go of the breath I had been unwittingly holding. "So, we're safe?" The morgue door banged open and another intern dashed inside. I recognized him as J.D., a timid guy who appeared to be in constant shock. "Dr. Scrit," he exclaimed across the room. "It's Dr. Brutzen. Rule 10. Despite the heat, a cold descended over the room, and my ass cheeks could have frozen together. "Prepare an OR, now," she shocks back authoritatively. He suddenly vanished. She turned to dash out of the room. "Dr. Scrit," I called back. She turned around to face me. "What should I do about the incinerator?" She stared back as if I had a dick instead of a nose. You should learn to recognize when something is dead, Dr. Aphlis. Enough haunts our lives without us carrying those who have abandoned us. Then she turned around and rushed out of the room. If you want to do something useful, take a gurney out to Court Street. The roof is far away from here. With that, she walked out the door. What the fuck is Rule 10? My hand flew into my pocket. It was vacant. Fuck. The list must have fallen out while I was loading the human mush into the incinerator. I needed a classmate to die before I could see the rules. But because it was so easily accessible, I had simply taken it for granted. I promised to learn a lesson from this, but I knew I wouldn't. I had read the regulations once. Why do I need a gurney? I decided to sprint outside and see what was going on first. The frigid night air clung to my cold sweat, sending goosebumps through every crevice in my body. I ran, and I saw nothing. There was no traffic. There were no persons. I looked left, right, and then left again. Then I looked up. Oh shit. That was Rule 10. Dr. Brutzen was standing a few steps from the edge of the roof. In the nearly full moon, I could see his body jittering as if it were kept together by marionette strings. The whole scene was wrong. How and why might his limbs be moving in that way? He moaned quietly. No, it was not it. He was crying. Nausea gripped me as I realized he was getting closer to the edge. I almost fainted as I remembered what the regulation required. Either wait for an extraction team to locate you or jump 4 stories to the sidewalk on Court Street. Wait there, I screamed at him. Dr. Skrit is coming to get you. No, please, Brutzenda screamed, but I'm not sure if he was talking to me. Don't make it angry. Make them go away. Hold on, I yelled back. You're almost safe. He wailed. I apologize. I attempted to lock them out. Please do not do this. His body bounced and flailed like an electric fish. It was so strange and awful to see this man jittering out of control in the rooftop moonlight that I almost sobbed. A door on the roof burst open so hard that I could hear it clearly on the ground below. No, Brutzen cried in response. No, please stay away. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Then he stepped back from the edge. I breathed a huge sigh of relief. That relief disappeared when I learned he had simply moved back to make room for a running start. I watched in terror as Dr. Brutzen, a co-worker and peer, dashed out and plunged into the night. He dropped, arms and legs twisting, toward the concrete 4 stories below where I stood. Being a doctor defies the notion that certain things are impossible. Most people have an implicit notion that the human body is sacrosanct, which protects it from an unsympathetic world. This is not correct. Consider the last object that broke unexpectedly. Did a dinner plate break into granules and shards as it slipped out of your washing hands? Perhaps you witnessed a watermelon roll off the grocery store display, splattering its fine, sticky goo over a 10-foot radius. That is within the capabilities of the human body. A loved one can be severely harmed. Nonetheless, I hoped, perhaps stupidly but passionately, that whatever alien force had breathed into the corners of St. Francis would be merciful to Dr. Brutzen as he flew to the ground. That was, of course, a foolish hope. The full moon revealed every detail as he smashed against the cement with an awful splash. His feet struck first, unable to slow the momentum as his ankles bent, and he likely shredded both Achilles tendons. His knees then crashed into the ground, fracturing both patellas. Dr. Brutzen's torso pitched forward and dropped simultaneously, his head bouncing back like a rubber ball. A little spray of solid items hit my ankles, and I realized immediately away that his teeth had blown out of his head like popcorn. For a split second, the night was silent. Then the convulsions started. I closed my eyes and took a slow, rattling breath. Compartmentalize. I could hear his torn, hollow cheeks flapping from the force of his spasms. If you fail to compartmentalize, someone else will suffer the price. I opened my eyes. I dove to Dr. Brutzen's side, soaking up everything I could at once. Face lacerations with significant hemorrhage. Nothing noticeable on the back of his head as the front took the fall. A compound fracture of the spine. Internal bleeding is likely, as are fractures to both tibias. There was more, of course, but I needed to monitor his respiration. Well, not really. I could hear his terrible intakes of air, and the spurts of blood indicated that he had a pulse, but his artery, most likely one of the subclavians, had ruptured. That is not a good sign. I raced around his quivering body, pressing firmly on his upper back to stop the blood geyser. "What the hell happened out here?" a voice yelled from across the pavement. I looked up and saw Lydia being followed by another nurse. They must have fled outside upon hearing the screams. Also, there's the splattering. "I need a gurney and a neck brace immediately. Prepare an operating room, we're going right to surgery." I felt alienated as I arrived at work. For a few moments, my hands worked on their own, fulfilling their implicit roles as the emotional part of my mind realized it needed to drift away. A young boy murmured sweetly into my ear, "It is your fault that there is no gurney here." We persuade ourselves that there was nothing we could have done to relieve someone else's pain. That is often difficult to believe since it is rarely true. I did not cry. I was too preoccupied with preventing exsanguination and avoiding compromising the exposed spinal column of a convulsing male. You know he's going to die. It won't happen immediately. Will it be 10 minutes? Or 20? The timbre of his voice, almost beautiful, could have passed for any young child's teasing if it hadn't been for the years of grief running deep beneath his words. Lydia emerged with a group of nurses and JD, the first-year intern who had informed us about Brutzen's rooftop promenade. I was still in command. I was still trying to save him. "He's stable, let's move." Once we had him on the gurney, I placed my order. As we rolled him into the hospital's front entrance, we came across Dr. Skrit, who was sprinting toward us. I just met her gaze once. It was enough to show me how severely I had failed by not following her directions to take the gurney outside with me. I shoved the judgment down into my chest, allowing me complete clinical attention on the task at hand. I knew in a remote manner that this failure would cut deep into my head once I had decompressed sufficiently to evaluate my pain. I would recover from it, but I would never be completely healed. Each mind is a tapestry of tattooed mental wounds, both apparent and unseen. The richest portraits often convey volumes in the stillness between words, and most of us are paralyzed by fear of hearing ourselves if we listen too closely. Monitorize the patient, attach an ECG and the defibrillator. His convulsions had ended, so had the blood spurts. "What's his BP?" Lydia peered carefully. 140 over 100, she answered bitterly. "Where else is he bleeding from?" "His internal lacerations are worse than we thought. I can see the spinal cord. Patient isn't breathing. Get him intubated. His trachea's too damaged. BP is 170 over 30, 1713. He's still losing blood somewhere. We can't stop the internal bleeding. Patient's still not breathing. The spine is exposed in 3 places. BP is 1913, doctor," Lydia said gently. At those remarks, the cardiac monitor made a furious beeping noise. His body convulsed again, as if every organ were sneezing at the same time. Sudden capillary ruptures sprayed blood into his eyes, nose, ears, and shattered mouth, as if a blood zit had popped from within. "We need to—" "Doctor," a voice broke through the din. I looked up and saw Dr. Skrit looking expectantly at me, then at the clock on the wall. No, I did not want to call the hour of death. As long as the work continued, I was able to avoid confronting feelings that I could manage but not tame. Dr. Scrit lifted an eyebrow at me. I let out a tiny breath of air. Time of death, 4:32 a.m. I'd like to see you privately, Dr. Aphelis. Okay, I have to finish here and now. I'm not sure if Dr. Scrit possessed any supernatural abilities, but she did have an incredible capacity to notify me of what I was about to do before I agreed to it. As a result, I found myself trailing her to the Chief of Medicine's office. I sat across from her, vowed myself not to cry, and dried my eyes. She studied me intently for a minute before speaking. Before you shed too many tears for yourself, Dr. Aphelis, remember that the impending grief for Dr. Brutzen's family will be far greater. The tears ended. She let the silence to linger for a little longer. You didn't follow my instructions when I said that you needed to produce a gurney. I swallowed. I'm sorry. So, she snapped, what response do you want to that sentiment? To hear that everything is fine? I did not respond. Well, I won't tell you that. It's not okay. I could not take the anticipation any longer. Am I fired? I should probably leave before Dr. Brutzen's family arrives. I could scarcely hear my own voice. She looked down at me through her small specs. Most people seek comfort in extremes, Dr. Aphelis. They want to be perceived as good, of course, but the second best alternative is never partially good, partially awful. Those who are told they aren't any good want to hear that they were wrong from the start, because it absolves them of any responsibility for facing the consequences of their actions. We seek solace in impossible places. She sighed, pursed her lips, and balled her quivering palm into a fist. I won't fire you for failing to be perfect, she finally said. My entire body released the strain I had been unwittingly harboring. I wiped my eyes once more. Dr. Scrit. When he landed, Dr. Brutzen experienced acute and instant stress. I don't think I could have saved him, even if I had followed your advice. Would you agree? She stood over me after getting up and walking around the table. I felt as if I were 2 feet tall. Now, Dr. Aphelis, I have something to ask you. Have you been struggling with the rules? Shit. Double crap. What was I supposed to say? That I had been the weak one who never received her own set? That I'd taken them from a deceased colleague? No. She knew it previously. Informing her that I had misplaced my stolen copy would undoubtedly be strike 3. I didn't need our strike 3 in that moment. She dug into her pocket and took out a piece of paper. It was gently soiled, as if it had been pulled from a pool of blood. You didn't appear to realize that you dropped these while assisting me in loading the dead boy into the incinerator. I like that kind of focus. As she handed me the list back, I felt a warm sensation creep across my chest. Don't fuck up again, Dr. Aphelis. The warmth faded. Keep an eye on Rule 7. You'll need it soon. I looked down at the rules. God darn it. And for the love of God, remember these. That is by far the simplest solution. I nodded obediently. These lists have a way of being problematic, she continued. Would you believe that people actually hate reading them? I looked at her in confusion. People hate the list of rules? Dr. Scrit raised her eyebrows. Yes. They claim there are too many of them, never to my face, but always behind my back. What? If they don't like the list of regulations, they can simply choose not to read it. She snorted. That would make the most sense, but some readers want me to save them from themselves. I shook my head in confusion. I'll never understand that. That's when the door flew open. J.D. gasped in as if he had been jogging. Dr. Dorian, what the hell are you unable to fix on your own? Dr. Scrit snapped. He was as white as a sheet. It's Dr. Brutzen. My gut turned into granite. He's dead, Dr. Scrit stated bluntly. Yes, very much so. he replied, taking frantic breaths of air. We noticed that his spinal cord had been cut around the neck. However, this has not prevented his body from getting out of bed, and he's quite angry. Everyone has that bitch in their lives. That bitch may make you feel really small. She never expresses sympathy or runs out of sarcastic comments. We loathe her with practically all of our souls, with the exception of a tiny bit in the corner that secretly wishes for the validation that would come from receiving her approval even once. Dr. Vivian Scrit was that bitch. For a brief time after JD entered the morgue, I believed she might freeze in place. Then I was trying to keep up with her, hoping that she had a plan to save our asses. "We watched Brutzen die," I yelled. "What do you mean his corpse has climbed out of bed?" He meant to convey the universally accepted definition of each word as it fits into an English language sentence. "Dr. Aphelis," Dr. Scrit said as we dashed after JD. "Despite what you learned in kindergarten, there are stupid questions, and they're distributed unequally across a population of individuals who remind us that free speech is an unfortunate reality." That bitch. We came to an abrupt halt in front of room 330. JD backed away, eyes wide, scared to open the door. I'm not sure what was going on in the room beyond, but it sounded like a subterranean giant had pushed a massive fart through 8 feet of mud, and it smelled twice as horrible. Dr. Scrit turned around and looked at the two of us with deadly calm. "I'm not sure if you're ready for what's on the other side. But the truth is that I don't give a crap, and neither does life, so you'll just have to live with it. Welcome to the realm of medicine." She leaned against the door, opening it wide. Dr. Brutzen appeared horrible when he was dead, but he was even worse now. He stood facing away from us, striking angry fists at everybody who approached. I couldn't see the back of his head because his neck had twisted, lowering his skull to the 6 o'clock position. Brutzen's body sustained major injury. He swayed back and forth, unable to gain a secure footing due to his damaged spine. Bony protrusions penetrated his skin, and the damaged remains of his vertebrae no longer formed a vertical line. The obvious beginning of livor mortis exacerbated the horror. The majority of his arm was horribly pale and yellowy gray, like inedible peaches. However, the backs of his thighs were an aggressive shade of strawberry jam. Tiny lacerations from the fall were squeezing concentrated blood through his skin like a jelly donut. Then he turned around. His head hung upside down from what used to be a neck, dangling from tattered skin. His jaw flailed aimlessly, showing a damaged mouth that had lately emptied its teeth in an evil enamel spray on my ankles. Cassie Endelman, a fellow first-year doctor in our class, slumped in a corner. Her neck was obviously broken. It appeared that she had been propelled against the wall at high speed. The analytical side of my brain recognized that she had died before hitting the floor. Lydia, the nurse, stood on the opposite side of the room. She held a shaky palm in front of her and slashed a scalpel at Brutzen's spinning arms as he approached. "Dr. Dorian, on my left!" Dr. Scrit yelled over Brutzen's roar. We turned back to see an empty spot where JD had formerly stood, and the sound of echoing footsteps echoed down the corridor. "I see Dr. Dorian wants to learn one of our rules the hard way," she exclaimed, turning to look at me sideways. "Dr. Aphelis, this has to happen now, so listen very carefully. When life gives you lemons, fuck it." She bent low and lunged at Dr. Brutzen's flailing body, smashing him against the wall. "Nurse, grab his arms and hold him down. Aphelis, open the cabinet in the corner." Lydia leapt into action, grasping his wrists and pushed him back. For a brief while, Brutzen was still. Then a guttural shout rattled the walls, indicating that he was about to overwhelm his two captors. "Decompartmentalize." I moved away from them and reached for the cabinet. When I spotted it on the door, I immediately grabbed both handles. 1913. It had not been there before. No cabinet was numbered. That isn't how cabinets work. This number had emerged unexpectedly, just for me, and this time I absolutely remembered the rules. I paused. Brutzen screamed, "Dr. Aphelis, now is not the time for slapdickery. Hurry!" Dr. Skrit commanded. I did not move. Dr. Skrit spoke again in a suddenly gentler, but still deathly frantic tone. "Only you can see what's in front of you right now, Dr. Aphelis, but there comes a time when you have to make the decision that you'll most be able to live with, and you don't have time to think." I inhaled deeply. I assured myself, I can handle this, as I opened the door. I was mistaken. Timothy's body was crushed on the floor, squashed into an unnaturally small shape for a 6-year-old, but he was still my little brother, peering up at me with slight judgment and immense anguish. The right side of his body had been charred into charcoal, whereas the left side was perfectly preserved. The worst aspect, however, was the fuzzy middle, where healthy skin and grilled flesh merged to form a horrifying imitation of my brother's visage. His right eye socket was vacant. His right cheek was gone. I could see deep into his tiny head because there was no skin to cover his teeth on that side. He licked his lips with a black tongue. "Why did you leave me, Ellie?" I froze. "Dr. Aphelis, we need you right now. You've only returned because you need something from me, right, Ellie?" My brother's corpse inquired. I sobbed, Lydia screamed, and the horrific sound of a broken bone rang around the room. "Why didn't you arrive in time to save me, Ellie? Why are you here now?" I struggled to talk. Then I noticed it. A cartoonishly big syringe clearly made of carbon steel, with the words H2SO4 emblazoned in bright yellow across it. The needle was buried, and I knew it would come out once activated. Timothy was squeezing it between his sinewy fingers. I need that from you, Timmy," I whimpered. He grasped it more tightly. "But why didn't you need me?" Lydia shouted again. "Time is almost up, Doctor." "I'm so sorry, Timmy," I wailed. "I did not want to leave you." "I know you don't understand, but just tell me. You know I love you." The tears flowed uncontrollably. "How?" he said sadly. "How can I know that you loved me if you left me to die?" "Dr. Aphelis, decide now." "I'm going to accept this, Timmy, but I love you so much. I am your favorite big sister, remember?" He returned the stare with frightening sobriety. "If you take this from me now, Ellie, I'll always remember that you only came back to help yourself and chose to leave me behind. You will never see me again." "No," I said sadly, removing the syringe from his weak hand. Then I turned away from my younger brother's ghost and ran to where I could make a difference. Lydia lay on the floor, both arms bent at an unusual angle. Brutzen pinned Dr. Skrit to the ground. His hands were wrapped around Dr. Skrit's wrists, and she was powerless to resist as his stronger arms came out to crush her eyes. The emotional component of my soul had worn so thin that no facade remained. Only a ragged, stony edge of logic remained as I worked effectively to complete the task at hand. I took 1, 2, 3 enormous steps to gain momentum, which I then turned into a powerful push of my arm. I didn't think about how accurate my aim was since it had to reach its goal, and there was no other option. Brutzen's eyeball squeezed and exploded as I rammed the syringe into his face. I felt the reaction as the trigger propelled the needle deep into his head, past his eye and into his frontal lobe. Then I collapsed to the ground. Brutzen leaned back and yelled. Dr. Skrit escaped quickly from his hands, turning to crawl towards me in a desperate scrabble. I sat spellbound, watching Brutzen morph in front of me. Sulfuric acid has a similar effect on the skin as an open flame, but I had never witnessed the consequences of firing H2SO4 straight into a brain, and the spectacle captivated me. Brutzen clutched the sides of his head as his face began to melt. He lacked the strength to remove the syringe from his eye, so it dangled in front of him like a strange, artificial phallus. Then he coughed, spraying blood on the floor, and leaned forward. His eyeball landed like a dropped stone. It was followed by a sticky gray sludge, which I assumed was his rapidly melting brain. I didn't believe I'd be able to tear myself away from the scene in front of me. "We need to get Lydia out of here," Dr. Scrit commanded. And then I realized I could do the impossible. I grabbed her shoulders as Dr. Scrit yanked Lydia's ankles, and we dashed out the door. She slammed it behind her. I collapsed to my hands and knees, dazed. The following several minutes were fuzzy. Dr. Scrit yelled a lot, and we were quickly encircled by individuals eager to help. I wondered dimly where they had been in those crucial seconds when we needed them the most. There are some soul-defining moments, I believe, that can only be experienced alone. Lydia was transferred to a gurney and wheeled away. The same doctor and janitor I'd seen twice before went silently into the room, spent a few moments inside, and then darted out. They each held a huge, damp garbage bag in one hand. She revealed herself using a glass of water. I sat across from Dr. Vivian Scrit, genius doctor and ultimate shit-bitch, hesitant and unable to disturb the peace that had descended upon the room. I was stained with my murdered colleague's blood, very certain that dead child goop was in my hair, and faintly conscious that I had gotten a touch of sulfuric acid on my jeans. The pause seemed odd. She was not ready to begin her explanation just yet, so she reached for the glass in front of her. It trembled, slightly at first, then severely enough to flow over the brink. She tried but failed to hide it, winced, and eventually turned off the water. She then supported her right wrist with her left hand, pressing it hard against the desk to keep it from shaking. And in an instant, the impregnable facade was shattered. I recognized Dr. Scrit for who she was, a fearful, mortal, unhappy person whose life was nearing its end rather than the beginning. Powerful enough to manage most people, but not strong enough to rule herself, given how far she deviated from normal. She was a bitch by choice, both strong and weak. "You've had a long night, Dr. Aphelis," she acknowledged in a measured tone. "Against great odds, I was wrong about how long someone like you would last at St. Francis." She exhaled. "So tell me, why are you here?" I briefly wondered if some type of supernatural paralytic had taken over my vocal cords before realizing she simply intimidated the shit out of me. "Fast replies are shallow, so I'll let you wait another day to respond. But it'd better be good." She leaned back in her chair. "So here's the thing. Most people enjoy learning things the hard way because they want to see if the principles of physics and common sense have changed to meet their specific demands. Toasters have warning labels because idiots exist." She looked at me closely. "Do not waste my time, Doctor. Capiche?" I nodded once. "Okay then," she breathed. "This is the day that I learned about rule number 7. You're giving me a school bus full of dead children on my first day as chief of medicine?" I asked Dr. Matthews, who was pale. "Well, no, most of them are. Well, they're alive for the moment, Dr. Scrit." I closed my eyes and let the lightning bolt of a pre-migraine rip through my head, lapping at the torn gray matter like a cat licking every drop of milk from the depths of his dish with a sandpapery tongue. For 3 seconds. Then I exhaled quietly, recognizing and appreciating the remaining anguish as a part of my mind that would help me move forward. "How far out are the first ambulances?" Dr. Matthews swallowed. "They should arrive at St. Francis within 4 minutes. The same storm that washed out the bus has shut down the Interstate 77 bridge across the Elk River, so... Are you telling me that Charleston Area Medical can't take any of the kids?" Well, that's kind of exactly what I'm saying. My headache has improved. How many surgeries are we going to need to perform? I asked gently. He grimaced. We're anticipating 12. That storm is dreadful. Why the hell was a school bus out in the... Never mind, let's set up this circus tent. We're severely understaffed for this crap, with hardly enough pediatric surgeons on a good day. I sighed deeply and calculated the numbers in my thoughts. Looks like a couple of interns are about to experience their first solo procedures. Dr. David Yangston was a standout football player in high school, most likely a quarterback, but he did not participate in college because he refused to recognize that he might develop while still talented enough to get away with it as a youngster. Dr. Andrew Branying was never good enough for his parents, so he pursued and attained academic excellence rather than embracing the inevitability that they would never be satisfied because he reflected mom and dad's poor decisions when they were younger. I knew this about both of them without having to ask. They wore their stories on their faces, as do all people, and I had long since resolved to be literate enough to read every unhappy story. We adore mystery because it allows for the potential that some unknown fable has a happy ending that we couldn't locate, while refusing to accept that people stop going forward when they stop believing in happy endings, or worse, find one. You're too young to be leading a solo procedure, but these kids are too young to die, so we're going with the lesser of two evils. We have twin children, aged 8, and we don't know anything about them yet. Dr. Branying, your patient has serious stomach wounds, whereas Dr. Yangston's has potential femoral lacerations. You'll learn more when they arrive. The doors blasted open. Game time! A dozen children rolled out of the rain and into St. Francis that day. The incinerator was bustling. I prayed to a demon I didn't believe in, hoping that my charge's mistakes would be minimized. Yangston and Branying were the only first-year interns assigned solo procedures, so I gave them the simplest cases. Moderate hemorrhaging, possibly from the femoral artery. Let's figure out what happened to this kid, Dr. Yangston said over his surgical mask. We have signs of internal bleeding. Let's put her under and figure out what's wrong, Dr. Branying murmured quietly, wiping sweat from his brow. We're losing a lot of blood, doctor, a nurse informed Yangston as he examined the boy's split-open leg. There's only one of us with the title of doctor before his name, and that person needs silence to focus, nurse. I had previously confirmed that Yangston had been slapped overhead, the head far too rarely as a child, but I was not about to reconcile this misfortune while he was wrist-deep in a split child. I looked over to Dr. Branying. The BP is too high, doctor, Nurse Alt said gently. 12.8, everything is fine, Branying said. I think your BP is too high, doctor, she winked. Relax, you got this. He nodded, his forehead glistening with sweat. I looked around again. He's lost nearly 1,000 ml of blood, doctor. We need to act now. Nurse, get out of my operating room, this is on me. And you're more of a distraction than a help. She turned and marched away, furiously eyeing me as she passed past Dr. Branying's operating room. Fortunately, no important organs or blood vessels have been injured. The bad news is that this piece of metal is lodged deep in her spleen, Branying explained. Remove the mesh, we need to do a splenectomy, and it has to be now. This is when Yangston's patient began coding. What the fuck is wrong with him? Blood loss is too great, doctor. I checked the blood loss. His numbers are fine. Those figures are appropriate for an adult. Is this your first experience working on a child? We did the hemogram test. Did you even check the results? Yangston's face flushed red against the white medical mask. You need to get the hell out of my OR. Nurse, your patient's coding. Now! My own heart had stopped by this time. When I heard Dr. Branying's patient coding just behind me, I experienced severe vertigo. What? What happened? You cut his splenic artery, Doctor, Alt said frankly. I'm sorry, he wailed. My hands were shaking. I'm so sorry. It's okay, Doctor, but you need to anastomose the vessel, she said in a sympathetic yet forceful tone. Okay. I can't stop shaking. Just give me a second. We don't have a second, Doctor. She's losing blood. Alt wiped the sweat off his brow. You can do this. Branying was starting to hyperventilate. Oh God, I do not want to lose her. Let us make this happen. Yangston flew across the Ohio River. With both of his nurses gone, he had entire control of the situation, moving his hands with surgical precision wherever they needed to go. It's unfortunate that he was 30 seconds behind schedule. We need a transfusion, he exclaimed. I turned back to gaze at Branying. Alt was constantly wiping sweat and tears from his face, yet he was still unable to see well. I could only stare at the crash cart as they both tried to do the work that I had expected of them. I recall the ID number 8251913 bouncing in front of me, like I would see those numbers again. Although the procedures were easy, I had a feeling one of them would fail. I despised the concept of intuition, yet I couldn't abandon it. Which did I think would die? Which one would I choose if I had to? Forcing a response to those questions reveals a great deal about ourselves. At any rate, intuition is nonsense. I cursed myself for believing in my emotions rather than plain reality. Mr. and Mrs. Arnaki, I am Dr. Vivian Scritt. We did everything we could, but your children's injuries were too severe to overcome, and we lost both of them. I'm so sorry. I'll give you a moment. I got up and departed because my comfort could not help me. I had the opportunity to make a positive difference in their lives, but I failed. If the moment for action has gone, the time for talking is over. Besides, I was still on the clock. But I was first in my class at UCLA, Dr. Yangston snapped, enraged. People make mistakes all the time, You've been sued for malpractice. And I won those suits, whereas you lost your appeal to avoid being fired. Your intelligence is excellent, but it cannot fill your inflated head. He took off his surgical mask and hurled it on the floor. Doesn't matter, he said, gazing at me with utter disdain. I am superior than this shithole city. I will discover a better place and be grateful for it. I raised an eyebrow. Dr. Yangston, the operation was uncomplicated. No matter how talented you were in a previous life, you're just a novice who is incapable of learning from mistakes. I leaned forwards. The world is a better place without you as a doctor. I turned and proceeded to the on-call room. Several procedures were still underway, but I needed to speak with Dr. Branying. I opened the door to find him kneeling by his locker, eyes bulging and face blue. A tattered bedsheet extended from his closed locker door to wrap securely around his neck. I lurched forward, trying to loosen the slack. But the moment I moved his body, I realized he was dead. After handling enough lifeless corpses, you can usually tell if a body is plagued by the ghost of its previous tenant, and I knew Branying was no longer a prisoner of himself. Nonetheless, I had to try. It took several seconds of battling to untie the cord from his neck, and finally I did. His lifeless body slumped to the ground. His head struck the bench with a horrible crack on the way down, yet he did not bleed. I was kneeling on the floor to perform CPR when I noticed the half-empty bottle of pentobarbital by my feet. He had taken too many barbiturates to fuck up a bull elephant. With every doctor in surgery, I attempted to restart his heart on my own. I battled for several minutes to find optimism in a dismal situation. I failed. Seneca noted that difficulties strengthen the mind as much as labor does the body, which is why I'm one of the smartest doctors you'll ever meet, Dr. Scritt had told me as she ended her story. I nodded slowly. Remember what I said about learning things the hard way? I blinked. She exhaled. Did you know that people pay more attention to a list of rules when it's harder to access? But I was never given a list, and you earned a lot of gray hairs, making sure that you learned them anyway, she said with humor. What do you say when someone who irritates you is absolutely correct? I was silent. Which brings us back to rule number 7, she said, folding her palms. Dr. Yangston was the brightest young mind we'd hired in 5 years. But the gravity of his duty couldn't keep his hubris in check, and he couldn't live up to the world's expectations of him. She placed a shaky hand on her forehead and stroked her temple. Dr. Branying could not look away from the gravity of the task in front of him, and that killed the arrogant confidence he needed to move on. So, I said, finally finding my voice, are you telling me I'm too arrogant or too meek? She chuckled. Both. Then Dr. Scrit placed her hands on the table, where one trembled slightly in place. Do you see what this means? She shakes her head. Don't answer that. Of course not. My face reddened as I maintained silence. In actuality, Dr. Aphalis, you need both weaknesses. I need someone in the operating room who understands that the simplest gesture may either make or break someone's world, and who realizes how serious any mistake is. Lifetimes vary depending on how good you are on any given day. When you fail by your own fault, and you will fail, destroying someone's life, you must have the arrogance to put it behind you and alter the world as if you accept the fiction that no ghosts haunt your past. That is rule number 7. Can you do 2 contradictory things at once? Yes, I said confidently. That's the correct answer, she said, smiling. No, you can't. You'll figure it out the hard way. Now get up. You're needed in surgery. My employer had just informed me that I was going to kill someone. The when aspect of the question remained unresolved, but the if component failed to cast even the faintest shadow of doubt. That is not an easy message to convey to a doctor. I stood up reflexively, but not out of astonishment. She had informed me that I was required in surgery, and I was so afraid of Dr. Vivian Scrit that I didn't want to irritate her by complying too slowly. I didn't realize there was a surgery scheduled. It wasn't... Sorry, I don't think it was on my... The funny thing about emergency surgery, Dr. Aphalis, is that the procedures are rarely planned. She peered at me through her thin spectacles, as if I were a young child receiving the third easy explanation for a problem that only bewildered me. Oh, right, I'm sorry. I turned around and instantly circled back, the blood on my Crocs causing me to slide slightly. Why am I going into emergency surgery? My voice shook as if I were doing something wrong. If a patient is counting on me to help them, that would make you a doctor, she said with certainty. Dr. Dorian is waiting for you in room 825. I inhaled deeply. Okay. Will we both be observing the procedure? He won't be observing much of anything, Dr. Aphalis, she said condescendingly. Patients under general anesthesia rarely understand what is going on. That's sort of the point. I felt my jaw drop. I wasn't sure if reacting with shock made me look stupider or unaffected, so I tried to stand in the middle of confusing social input that defined my difficult moment between birth and death. She furrowed her brow at me. I can see by your reaction that you're focused on meeting my expectations, but eventual failure is simpler to accept if you prioritize the objective result over transient cultural expectations. Run! I got to room 825 in under 2 minutes. JD was laying unconscious on an operating table. I had just seen him a few minutes before when he ran out of an operating room that had held Dr. Brutson's very angry corpse. And here he lay, comatose and ashen-faced, looking like a deflated balloon. There was just one other person in the room, a young nurse. "What happened?" I yelled in desperation. "I don't know. The patient is being monitored and we're waiting for an ECG reading." Blood pressure is 10-6 and falling. There are no obvious lacerations, evidence of internal bleeding or trauma. I grabbed my hair and twisted it forcefully. JD was not a patient. He was a person, and his pain made no sense, much like Brutson's anguish and death, or Myron's odd self-cannibalism. I wanted to scream and smash the wall before curling up in the janitor's closet and eating 2 pints of thrifty chocolate malted crunch ice cream in one sitting. So I closed my eyes, exhaled, and counted to 3. Compartmentalize. I opened my eyes and realized there was a puzzle in front of me. What state was he found in? A janitor came across him lying unconscious on the ground just outside the front door. Have his vitals changed? Not in the past 3 minutes. Grab a ventilator filter and prepare for a possible intubation. Yes, doctor. I need to see if I can find beep, beep, beep. What's wrong? Patient's experiencing ventricular fibrillation. Let's move. Defibrillators ready, doctor. The initial pulse of electricity lifted his chest several inches off the table. I watched in horror as his mouth opened and his tongue flopped across his cheek. That was not typical. The second jolt propelled him almost a foot into the air. His fingers swirled and jittered before finally coming to rest at his side, strangely straight. My blood ran cold as his gray fingers twitched, as if searching for an invisible trigger. The nurse blanched. Patient's not showing any cardiological signs. He's been shocked, doctor. I prepared the defibrillator once more, wondering what might happen during the 3rd cycle. I was prepared for anything. I was startled. I applied 1,000 volts of electricity to JD's heart, but nothing happened. He did not move. He did not twitch. Suddenly, none of his vital signs indicated life. I called time of death on a colleague for the 2nd time that night, 19 minutes after leaving Dr. Scritt's office, and 13 minutes after starting a fruitless CPR attempt. I fired the nurse halfway through in the hopes that she would save some patients and give them a reasonable chance to postpone death. After accepting defeat, I wiped away tears and snot as I gazed down at JD's lifeless body. That is when he opened his eyes. I then opened my bladder. He did not have any pupils or irises. Only a sea of sorrowful whiteness stretched between his lids, vacant, sad, and soul-crushingly empty. His limp arm gripped my wrist tightly enough to send lightning bolts of anguish into my shoulder. His corpse slowly began to sit up. "Ellie," he muttered. His voice seemed weak and distant, like an echo coming up from a tight cave. I attempted to pull away, but he was simply too strong. "Your brother, Timmy, is here in hell with me," I sobbed. "He wants you to know something," he said in an evil echo, staring at me with no eyes to focus. "He claims that it is your responsibility that he is here, and that if you ever loved him, you will come down to burn with the rest of us. Every second hurts so deeply that he wishes he had not been born." He growled at me. Then he slumped on the table, dead. I drew my arm away from his chilly fingers and staggered into the corridor. Tears were forming like storm clouds, slowly but heavy and fierce. I could feel the heavy, humid heat and charged strain behind my eyes, and I could see my breaking point approaching, unavoidable and unstoppable. When I looked up, I saw her across the corridor. Nobody else was present. Dr. Scritt was looking me down like a rival at the OK Corral, and I knew that this moment had to rip something apart so that its horrible seed might spread its wicked tendrils across the blurring lines that separated this hospital from my own thoughts. Tears and words flowed uncontrollably from my face. Sam Brutson, Myron Caldwell, Jim Dorian, and Cassie Endelman perished tonight, Dr. Scritt. What is happening at St. Francis? She drew a small white line across her lips. To be honest, I expected you to be first, Elia Phalis. She folded her arms. I folded mine. Rule 9, verbatim now. The morgue must have at least 13 cadavers at all times, I said without thinking. A faint smirk brushed past her lips, which she hastily hid. Dr. Dorian failed to fulfill his responsibilities during Dr. Brutson's illness. Dr. Aphalis, this hospital may both give and take life, but it never does so without meaning. Dr. Skrit took a big breath. Unfortunately, Dr. Dorian opted to break the rules when the morgue only had 12 residents. The crooked scales have a way of balancing themselves, and we never know the outcome. I wanted to respond, to tell her she was mistaken, to explain everything she had neglected because the world had soured her wrong and prejudiced judgment. It was evident that she was acting intentionally, but as I opened my mouth to speak, not a single word came out. Dr. Skrit nodded slowly. There are some things we shouldn't see but must face. Are you ready? Yes, I snapped. No, child, you are not. All of the dead persons you mentioned were smarter and more educated than you. Do you understand what's at stake, given the penalties they've all faced? Unable to find my voice, I nodded. She rolled her eyes. Human reproduction is driven mostly by stupidity, and the only reason we've made it this far is because our idiotic desire to kill ourselves is slightly outpaced by our idiotic need to engineer unplanned pregnancies. She rubbed her temples. Now, if you are going to have an emotional breakdown, please do it now. It's better to send you out the door with broken hopes weighing down an inadequate mind than with a room-temperature body weighing down an abused gurney. I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there. She shakes her head. People with brighter minds than yours have failed to achieve half of what you seek. Why are you still here, Dr. Aphelis? I wiped away a tear. Maybe you feel it's unfair that the past has changed you, so you want to change the past. My breath caught. Every doctor aspires to be a forerunner between life and death. However, we know that the latter will finally triumph. Why are you here? I shake my head. I can't change the past, I muttered. All I have is me and the present. One of us will control the other. I cleaned my nose and eye, wishing I'd done everything in the reverse sequence. She turned sharply around and walked away. I followed without instructions. We came to a halt in an average section of a hallway that I had passed countless times before. The funny thing is, nothing is ordinary. I was dumbfounded, staring at a door that had never existed before. Dr. Skrit refused to look at the structure. Instead, she stood next to it, glaring at me in harsh judgment. It's too late to ask if you comprehend what I'm about to say, so I'll do my bit and leave you with your options. No average individual can become a doctor, and no ordinary doctor can live at St. Francis. The wisest decision would be to walk away right now and live a long life of predictability and ignorant delight, only to return decades later with the illusory belief that death is a possibility. I've done everything in my ability to warn you not to continue from here, since what you see at the end of the trail will not be pleasant. She narrowed her gaze at me. If you choose not to give up, that's on you. Then she turned and went quickly away from me. I tried, but failed, to settle my shaky breath. I knew I'd walk through the door in the same way I got out of bed every morning. There was just one way forward. I slowly looked up at the door, which was not actual outside at the time. A number was etched into the antique wood. 1913. I had mastered the rules by this point, but they no longer mattered. Despite my discomfort, I stretched out a frail hand and turned the knob. It opened effortlessly, almost affectionately. I gulped and nodded. As I walked forward, the slight smell of smoke entered my nostrils. I assured myself I could handle whatever was inside. I was mistaken. The most serious threat to our future is that we base it on a desire to modify the past. Regret becomes a linear function of time, and the best legacy we leave our children is a fleeting naivete about our sense of loss. I changed my mind about opening the door as soon as I touched it, and attempted to return just as the latch snapped shut. It wouldn't reopen, of course, but I wasted my time trying. I closed my eyes to prevent the tears from flowing and the burn at bay. St. Francis was an unbelievable place, and much of what I saw that night contradicted all I knew about reality. But what I experienced on the other side of this door stretched my thoughts like bubblegum. I imagined a fat, drooling man chewing on my brain with passionate, aggressive gnashing, carelessly squishing the gray matter between clean, white teeth. This could not be. The cicadas proved me wrong. They chanted a never-ending shrieking hymn that crushed against my senses with an intensity only equaled by the oppressive humidity of a hot Missouri July. I knew that when I opened my eyes, I'd see the blood-red cardinal flowers dancing lazily in the midday light, unconcerned about the blood-red fire that was burning my boyhood home. I opened my eyes when I heard the cry. There was no debate about its provenance. I knew Elia Felis, 12, was ready to run out of the roasting structure, her clothing scorching hot enough to destroy her dermis and leave an unsightly lasting mark on her tiny body. I immediately understood she couldn't see me. Her scared eyes begged for aid but found none. She was a smart girl, so she knew to hit the ground and roll about until her burning blouse was doused. She'd be unable to peel it off as the flaming polyester ate its way into the grafted flesh. However, removing the clothing was not her concern. She jumped to her feet and spun around to face the flaming building, too scared to re-enter and too embarrassed to walk away. "Timmy!" she shrieked. "I'm sorry I told you to fuck off. You need to leave your room. Timmy!" She took a step back as the blazing house emitted another tongue of flame. The shriek came from upstairs. "I know you can hear me. You need to get out of the house, now." "Ellie," his voice was gentle, but it exuded more fear than could have been possible. "I'm not sure how to get out. You have to help me." The tiny girl froze. "Please come and rescue me, Ellie. I'm sorry that I stole your PC. Please get me out of here. It's growing really hot, and I believe the fire will soon enter my bedroom." She sobbed and said nothing. Then she closed her eyes and rushed into the home. One foot had crossed the threshold before she spun and jumped back out, arms wrapped over her face. "You must get yourself out, Timmy." "I can't go in there," she cried through the second-story window. "Yes, you can, Ellie. Please, my door is on fear. No one else is home. You must come get me." She started crying openly now, with deep, guttural cries piercing her weak frame as she walked several steps away from the home. "Timmy, sob, you must jump. Sob, I'm sorry, but I can't help you. It's not too far to the earth." "I can't jump." "Ellie, the fire is in my room." "No." She doubled over and took a step back more. "Please, jump." "Ellie, you can go in the back door. Go around the other side. My bed is on fire. It's too hot." Her jaw trembled. I can't go in the back door, Timothy," she said in a much lower voice. "Yes, you can." "I'm too scared," she said, trailing off. "I'm burning and it hurts." She collapsed to the ground, burying her face in her hands. Young Ellie remained like this for a long time, but Timothy said nothing else. The north wing of the home collapsed right as firefighters arrived. The first engine was understaffed. No matter how many times they yelled at her, no one could find the time to physically remove the terrified girl away. So she watched while they calmed and then controlled the flames. "My brother is in the house," she murmured. They were experienced firefighters, not therapists, and they rushed in to save him without considering their own safety or her comfort. She snatched the last one before he fled from her. "Over there," she said in a scarcely audible voice, pointing to the wreckage of the north wing. He responded without acknowledging her, racing to dismantle the blazing rubble of the boards and glass that she had once called home. "Johnny! Roy! Call an ambulance right now!" He dropped the blackened wood of my damaged house and came to a halt. Then he bent over and vomited. I wanted to encourage the little girl to stop walking, to turn aside, and spend her life wondering how dreadful death could be rather than confirming that the worst of our ideas were correct. But I knew she wouldn't have listened to me, even if I had the ability to alter the globe. So she drifted on, propelled less by interest than by the dreamy sense of responsibility that underpins the vast bulk of every activity we will ever undertake. I knew the sensations would strike her in stages. That is how roasted human meat smells, followed by "I can hear moaning. He's still alive." And right on its heels. I've never heard a person die, but I'm confident that's what's happening in front of me. Then, all at once, the image appeared. I discovered that I had been mindlessly following in her footsteps, unable to turn away because it was impossible to touch ghosts who did not see me. She and I arrived at the fire station at the same time, staring into the ruins of our lives at the same devastating moment. Timmy's skin has been stripped away completely. Even after years of medical experience, I would not have realized that the mound of human meat beneath me was a 6-year-old human without prior information. His lips had been blasted away, leaving every teeth exposed to the outside world. The char on his torso resembled a combination of rare steak and popped zits. But it was his eyes that drew me in the most. Without lids, they peered fixedly into the sky, as if shamelessly expecting a god to care and appalled by what he saw in return. Then he opened his mouth and yelled. It was far quieter than the recollection etched in my 12-year-old mind. In retrospect, I had always assumed it was a gale force shriek, announcing to everyone who disputed my guilt. However, watching it again revealed that it was a weak, gurgling, mournful cry issued by a creature far too feeble to comprehend the concept of death. The sobbing contradicted my memories. I had imagined myself dropping in a heap and groaning softly, completely too broken to cry. It took a few seconds for me to realize I was crying in the past present, surrounded by people but completely alone. I lurched forward, clambering over the shattered wood in an attempt to get closer to what remained of my brother. I'm not sure what motivated my acts, but none of us know what drives our true intentions. My foot got snagged on a wayward board, and I came face to face with his corpse. I heaved, but I had to talk. I mumbled, "I'm sorry," to the memory. I've spent every day since this one lamenting what I didn't accomplish. This is why I am a doctor. But the past does not disappear. I took a trembling breath. "Please, just tell me that you loved me, even as you hated me." I knew he was dead, but I didn't grasp the rules of the world after 1913, so I hoped. That hope was realized when my brother moved his head. For the first time, someone noticed my presence here. "Go through the door, Ellie," I gasped and blinked. When I opened my eyes again, he was staring up, plainly dead. Had I imagined his instructions? Was I just imagining things? I turned back to face the shattered little girl. She curled up into a ball, eyes wide open and mouth gasping like a fish, desperately wanting to be hugged and loved by anyone and finding nothing. I knew the emotional anguish was burning its way into her synapses in the same way that the melting shirt was dissolving the middle layer of her flesh, breaking it down cell by cell with each tick of the second hand, leaving indelible wounds that would forever seek treatment that no doctor could ever deliver. I left her there. I remained there, swaying, unsure where to proceed, but confident that the road would eventually present itself to me. I struggled out of the blazing rubble. I walked from the heat to the light and stood in the front yard, which I hadn't seen in 14 years. I had always been happy there, which is why I never returned. The door in the center of the yard was new. It stood unnaturally in the center of the grass, appearing from nowhere and leading nowhere. I was certain that I was the only one who could see it, as it was intended solely for me. I stumbled, I walked, and then I walked confidently toward the knob, gripping it, acknowledging that I was broken, but not totally. I nodded at myself. Then I turned the handle, opened it wide, and stepped forwards. I was greeted by the bitter stench of smoke. The whine of cicadas reached me next, followed by the thump of the door closing behind me. I closed my eyes tightly as the blood-red fire that was destroying my childhood home burned through my lids, refusing to take the next step on a path that only claimed to care about my viewpoint. I opened my eyes when I heard the cry. I recently graduated from medical school and discovered the meaning behind my hospital's mysterious rules. I passed through the door I had always sought and found. It closed softly behind me. I watched helplessly as the 12-year-old version of myself went through the kind of suffering that adults mislead themselves into believing they can deny their children. I watched my younger brother burn. This time I saw more of his body. The first astonishment gave way to a doctor's unwaveringly critical gaze. His burned vertebrae and severed spinal cord fell disgustingly to the ground like butcher's offal. I vaguely thought Timmy must have landed on his neck, bursting his damaged insides as his roasted skin shredded from the shock of the crumbling house. It broke more of me than I ever imagined imaginable. Deep cracks sliced my consciousness in ways I would have thought hard to sustain. But I left the broken pieces of myself on the road and discovered that I could travel lighter with less of me to carry. To be completely honest, it was ruthlessly efficient. In that moment, I realized how the world can transform a person into the classic shit bitch. And as I grew stronger, I was able to complete the voyage once more, this time with confidence, gripping the door on the other side, now more entire because my spirit was less present. The smoke reached me first, followed by the steamy humidity of a classic Missouri summer. Of course, there was a scream. I collapsed on the ground, unable to proceed further. I got up, of course, because what else could I do? I had to decide whether to move on or spend the rest of my life utterly immobile. I wasn't going to let the location of fate's arbitrary decision dictate the rest of my life. So I stood and relocated. I went through everything again. And I realized how much of me might be broken while still progressing. I arrived at the end. I opened the door, and I stepped into the scream. I once heard that the trees in West Texas are sculpted by the winds that blow across the plains. The relentless pressure warps them. Eventually, no matter how large the tree, it is forever ruined by a world that will never stop. The plant's original design is no longer recoverable, and the brokenness becomes a permanent part of the tree's character. It will never be able to realize its original purpose. However, the tree continues to grow. It was simpler to travel without the load of hope, so I let it go with the 7th opening. I casually entered Dr. Scritt's office. "Close the door behind you," she instructed. Out of pragmatism, I stood in front of her. "Well," she looked at me over her small specs. "Are you going to have a long cry about it and then talk about what happened? Or will you skip the section with little practical use so that we don't waste any more of my time?" I sat on the chair across from here. "I've exhausted every tear," I said simply. "Good," she replied. "I hope that fact lightened your burden." I was about to ask her why she was so cruel, but I stopped myself. People only change if they want to change. I had no desire to argue with facts that didn't care if I believed in them. She gave me a careful look. "You never told all of the story because you were afraid of what people would say." I nodded. My mind was so strained, stunned, and used that I could only provide harsh practicality. "How did you know?" She appeared sad. "Because, Dr. Afflis, that's everyone's story." I looked at her blankly. She exhaled. Each of us is ashamed of some aspect of our past. We believe that keeping it a secret gives us control over something beyond our grasp. This is due to people being stupid. I received no response. Letting go of the incorrect belief entails controlling the past, Ellie, to the limited amount that we still can. You are not losing anything by quitting the delusion. I took a deep breath. I feel like admitting it. Makes you a shitty person, yes, I know, she said, rolling her eyes. But admitting the truth does not make you a bad person. It's what you did that makes you unhappy. She remained silent while flaring her nostrils. Without preamble or permission, I began my explanation. Timmy and I had been fighting, I exclaimed. I had just gotten a new laptop. Since I was 12 and he was 6, I received many of the items that Timmy desired, but could not obtain. I gloated when he sobbed because it made me feel richer. My father was a janitor, and we couldn't afford much of what I believed I wanted. So, when I finally received the laptop, I thought I deserved. I ridiculed my brother more than ever before. I took a big, trembling breath. So he stole it while I wasn't looking and locked himself in my bedroom. I'd never been so enraged. I told him to fuck off, which was the first time I'd ever said that. His favorite stuffed animal, a ridiculously large bear, was left alone in his bed. So I stole it, yelled across the house that I was about to destroy it, and dashed downstairs. I hid my face in my palms. I placed it on the stove, switched on the pilot light, and was overjoyed when it finally caught fire. Timmy dashed into the kitchen just as the flames consumed his bear. I was pleased as I realized how severely I had hurt him, more than he had ever felt. The suffering I had given my brother was so nice in that moment, and I'm not sure why, but I was certain he deserved it. I halted. Then I proceeded because I had nothing else to do. He threatened to throw my laptop out the window, lock himself in my room, and smash it into pieces on the ground. Then he turned and ran. I cleared my throat. So I grabbed the stuffed bear's leg, which was dangling off the edge of the stove and not yet burning, and I hurled it at him. I pursed my lips and nodded sincerely at myself. Why would a 12-year-old make a decision unless it seemed like a good idea at the time? I didn't anticipate the bear hitting the wall and landing in the trash bin, and I had no idea how rapidly a garbage fire could spread across a kitchen. I bit my lip and tasted blood. But I was old enough to consider my options. I knew I had enough time to walk up the stairs but not back down, because the fire had burned half of the kitchen in less than 20 seconds. I took a few weak breaths. I also knew that I could exit through the kitchen's back door to immediate safety. More shallow breathing. I needed to make a practical decision in a split second. I was still enraged in that split second. I was angry not only at my brother, but also at myself, though I was too young to realize it at the time. I swallowed. It would have been much easier to argue that it was all cold practicality or all passionate vengeance. I thought like a child, yet I was grown enough to realize what my decision meant. The truth is that both beliefs drew my mind through a contorted landscape of clashing ideas, disregarding the dignity of being all one thing or all the other. I dropped my hands to my sides and stared unwaveringly at Dr. Skrit. I chose to turn my back and rush outside. I recall every aspect of that decision. It wrecked my heart and mind so horribly that I'm certain I'll never be whole again. I took another big breath. But every day hurts a little more because I can't stop thinking about what I'd do if I could go back. And I know I'd probably still make the same decision. For the first time in my memory, she broke eye contact first. "Ellie," she said with a laugh, "why do you think that St. Francis Hospital would have such an arbitrary set of rules for its interns?" I replied without emotion. "The rules originate from somewhere beyond us. I understand now. We're only here to follow them." She appeared sad. Dr. Skrit gently shook her head. No, Dr. Aphelis, that is not true. Dun sewer. She rubbed her eyes. What was the first rule? Never under any circumstances share your copy of the rules with anyone else, I repeated robotically. She lifted her eyebrow. And how does that make any sense? I stumbled as I attempted to recall her remarks. It was important to see. Not all of us were going to make it. That much is true, she said dismissively. We've seen plenty of proof of that tonight. But you are mistaken about the rule coming from somewhere else. She looked at me intently across her desk. I glanced back in disbelief. I don't understand. Then you're starting to get it, she responded. You weren't top of your class, Dr. Aphelis, not even close, but you're intelligent enough to be a doctor. Can you try to work this out? I rapidly assessed the probabilities of embarrassing myself in relation to the probability of answering correctly and remained mute. She shook her head, disappointed. Did you truly never make those connections, Dr. Aphelis? The trial of jumping from a roof? A judgment from an authoritative janitor? Multiple separate rules for burning children? My jaw fell. The first rule forbids the sharing of rules because no one has the same set. Each doctor faces his or her own set of constraints, and most aren't up to the task. I tried to find the words. Every rule is just for me. Dr. Skrit removed her glasses. People think that this hospital wants to destroy them, when in reality, each person is given every tool needed for survival, she snorted. It's impossible to stop most individuals' desire to kill themselves. I glanced at her desk, stunned. But Rule 4, why did it tell me not to touch your Reese's peanut butter cups? She looked at me as if I had been caught masturbating in a fish tank. Because it's my favorite candy. I nodded slowly. Mine too. Dr. Skrit put the glasses back on her head. You're going to ask what this place is, she said gently. I've been with St. Francis far longer than most. That is why people expect me to inform them. She hesitated and carefully selected her next words. So before you say that you want me to tell you the truth, you should understand this fact. She bored her eyes into mine, and this time I turned away quickly. There are things I cannot and do not know. Embracing these beliefs as a strength rather than a weakness has allowed me to persevere where others have failed. We were quiet for some while. Can you see the individual rules on each doctor's paper? I inquired suddenly. She smirked. No, but I can see what is written on their faces, and it is the same thing. I don't get it, I said honestly. She sighed, disappointed. Do you remember when I reminded you of Rule 9? I remembered our talk shortly after Dr. Dorian's death. You told me that the morgue needed 13 cadavers at all times, I said confidently. No, she snapped back. You told me that. I pretended to know everything all along, and you responded to my confidence. Each person's set of rules represents their own struggle to fight. To be candid, I'd rather see doctors fail themselves due to incompetence than see patients suffer because someone couldn't live up to their own unwarranted arrogance. I blinked. I'd like to earn my arrogance, I told myself. Dr. Skrit smiled. The good news is that I think you might have the endurance to survive the unusually lengthy journey it would take for you to achieve earned arrogance. Before I could say anything else, the door burst open. I didn't say anything as a familiar janitor confidently entered Dr. Skrit's office. For the first time, I heard him talk. 3 children have been dead for 119 minutes. 13 people are not in the morgue, and Dr. Falhar ignored me when I tried to stop him from stealing Dr. Grolt's list. Dr. Skrit rose, and I followed suit. Wait, Dr. Skrit, please. I gazed at her with desperation. She gave me a look that indicated I had 1/4 of a second to speak. Is this real? She looked away and walked around her desk. Death is real, Nothing else is assured. Doctors are responsible for delaying the inevitable and accepting the truth that all of our efforts will inevitably fail. I went briskly after her as she followed the janitor out of her office. If death is the only true thing, then this life is where impossible things can occur. Stop disputing this fact. Now, grab the sulfuric acid. We're going to try to stop your fellow interns from killing each other or any of the patients. The janitor eventually stopped working for us. Perhaps he was, but not physically. At any rate, only Dr. Skrit and I entered the room where Grote and Falhar were fighting. The latter had pinned the former to the ground, and I recognized a familiar list in Dr. Grolt's palm. They each weighed 100 pounds more than I did. I stared at them and froze, realizing I couldn't stop them. Dr. Skrit, whose frame was almost identical to mine, rushed past me. "Hey!" she shrieked. "Cut that shit out!" But he took my... Now! Then Dr. Skrit turned and walked out the door. The two doctors did not respond at first. Then Falhar carefully stood and backed away from Grout, who was struggling to get to his feet. I returned my jaw to its proper position before turning to depart. "I still know what you did," said a whisper from behind me. I turned back around. Dr. Grote looked at Dr. Falhar incredulously. "You're absolutely insane. Do you know that?" Falhar surged, and the following few seconds blurred around me. I gradually realized that I had jumped between them to hold Dr. Falhar back. He was crying. "I didn't kill him 5 years ago, and I've been regretting it every day since." His face became ashen as he fought to find his next words. I turned to see Dr. Grout crushed against the wall, horrified. He was already chubby, and all I could think of was a scared-looking Pillsbury doughboy with a shaking, scrub-covered tummy. I rolled my eyes and faced Dr. Falhar. "Did you break a rule?" His eyes filled with tears. I knew he was breaking, and that angered the fuck out of me. I'd use shorter sentences, but my initial query had only 5 words, and English syntax prohibits me from dumbing it down any further. It came out of my mouth as if someone else was talking. I considered the space between the doors, wondering how much of myself had been burned away. "I looked in room 825, he muttered. "I saw something from your past that triggered the ammonia smell that tells me your scrubs are going out with the trash," I said with anger. "Listen," I repeated in a more soothing tone. "Why don't you head to the break room and drink a nice, warm cup of get the fuck over yourself, then come back when you're ready to undertake the monumental task of executing your employment obligations without committing homicide?" He looked at me like an idiot. "Because if I can get over myself, anyone can." The words flowed like water down a drain, leaving me empty but clean. I turned to look at Dr. Skrit's reflection in a glass cabinet. She smiled. 6 of us survived the first year. Falhar was among them. Grote wasn't. People, doctors, and ghosts arrived and left. Most had a mistaken feeling of permanency about their own existence, and were surprised when the next turn of life's wheel replaced their carefully crafted niche with someone equally disposable. I persevered. There wasn't a precise time when I knew I wanted to be the chief of medicine, or even when I understood I desired it. The drive grew gradually within me, and I was halfway down the road before I understood where I was going. Years have passed. St. Francis Hospital continued to be unusual, but I decided to quit trying to comprehend it. I gradually learned to grasp how unusual humans are. Accepting the hospital's idiosyncrasies was much easier in that environment. I still cremated children after providing appropriate condolences to their parents. I never went on the roof, and I silently disregarded room 1913 whenever it showed. I also never ate anyone else's candy because I am not a monster. I was sitting across from Dr. Skrit when she read a thank you message from a patient she had diagnosed and successfully saved. Despite the fact that it was several hundred words long, she threw it away after only a second perusal. "Did you know that Vivian means life?" I asked. She snorted. "I am what I do." People despise that truth, which is why they assign labels in the first place. The next big change was approaching. It permeated my thoughts like damp air whispering of an impending storm. I thought I was prepared for it, which demonstrated that certain lessons are never learnt. I had been traveling down the same hallway that had drawn me in years before. On that day, just a familiar janitor inhabited its halls. I'd seen him several times over the years, rarely conversing and never maturing. This time, he addressed me directly. "It's time to make a choice, Ellie," he said softly. My blood froze as my urethra dissolved. He shifted his gaze to a slot in the wall that had only sometimes housed an actual door. It remained there, slightly ajar. The numbers were deeply engraved in the wood, twisted and weathered as if they had been there for years. "Why does it say 31991? I asked. He grinned sadly. "It's your opportunity to go backward." I swallowed. I'd become accustomed to intimidating others to boost my confidence, but I felt vulnerable in this situation. "Where does it lead?" I asked shakily. "Rural Missouri," he said in a parental tone, "far from any town. About 30 minutes from Drisking." He lifted his eyebrows. "But that's not the real question, now is it?" I closed my eyes. "When does it lead?" He paused until I looked at him again before continuing. "August 25th, 2005. I brushed away a tear. "Can it go any earlier?" "No," he promptly replied. "I'd have very little time to prepare. The world turns on what people do with very little." I dried my face, but I rapidly lost control of myself. "Okay," I said, my voice cracking. "I need to go back." I took a deep breath. "I can get ready in a few days. Where can I find the door?" The janitor stood still. "Right here, right now." My stomach sank. No, I'm not ready right now. I need to be ready if my life is going to change." The tears and snot flowed unchecked, and I was losing my will to stop them. He folded his hands silently. "If you don't go now, the door will disappear. You will never see it again." I sank to my knees. What options did I have? "Okay," I whispered. "Okay, I'll go now." I looked up. "When I come back, will the world be different?" He remained silent for a beat. Afterward, "You can only come back the hard way, Ellie." My stomach dropped. That was 26 years ago. I can't lose that much of my life. He exhaled. "Yes, you can. People lose that much every day." I sobbed once. "Will, I do not understand. Is my body going to reverse its age, or will I look like this and die 26 years earlier?" "You don't get any extra time, Ellie," he said patiently. "Any year that you live twice takes away from what would have been." I barely held back the impulse to puke. "But," I screamed, "will it be like the last time I went back? Will I be able to modify things now?" He smiled more joyfully this time, but it was still tinged with sadness, which I believed was a permanent feature of his existence. "The past will be yours to change as you like. Your choices will change the world." Adrenaline rushed through me. "Ellie," he answered, "you always knew that last part was true, right?" The floodgates opened, and I ugly cried. I leaned forward and pressed my hands against the floor. "I need time to process this." "You don't have time and don't need it. Right now, you have to walk through that door or leave forever." He reached out, grabbed the knob, and started pulling it close. We want to assume that important judgments take time because it permits us to imagine that profound contemplation alters our most primal instincts. but we are our genuine selves at fleeting moments of high consequence, so I jumped to my feet. I pushed through the door just as he closed it behind me for the last time. They say that a new door opens every time an old one closes, but it's a load of nonsense for individuals who are too terrified to realize that the past is gone. The door shut behind me with a dead sound. I was in the hallway at St. Francis Hospital. When I turned back, I saw the door to the same janitor's closet where I had first read a list of rules years before. I cautiously opened it and had a peek inside. The foul odor of ammonia greeted me as I grabbed for the bare bulb and pulled the cord. Sallow light illuminated a neglected storage space and nothing else. "You won't be able to enter Narnia again through that route," a voice said from behind me. I turned around to see the usual janitor standing patiently next to me, hands in his pockets. I'd gotten quite skilled at reading faces over the years of dealing with dying and otherwise inept individuals, but I couldn't for the life of me tell what was going on in his eyes. He was the same age as always, so I had no idea what year it was. Then I heard a buzz from a Nokia push-button phone on a nearby counter. I looked up and saw the boxy television hanging from the ceiling. It contained a grainy presentation of American Idol with Simon Cowell, who appeared to be still alive. I reached into my pocket to retrieve my iPhone iX, only to realize that I had left it in another coat. My head spun. "They're waiting for you," the janitor said simply, his hand out. Dazed, I took 3 steps in the direction he'd pointed. When I turned around, he was gone. So I stepped 1 foot in front of the other, determined to keep moving until I figured out where I was supposed to be. "You're early," a voice called out. "There's an auspicious beginning." I looked down the hall until I realized I was approaching Dr. Scritt's office. The voice was coming from the inside. I passed through the door. The room was terribly furnished, and I felt a surge of admiration for the style that Dr. Scritt would soon introduce. A storm raging outside perfectly suited the ambiance created by the taupe and gray curtains. A short, balding man waddled over to me, hand extended. His clothing style reflected the "can't groom myself" theme that pervaded his overall appearance, and I prayed for his sake that he made up for his lack of physical attraction with intellect. "Jerry Ringwater, CFO, is delighted to meet you. The higher-ups have been predicting your arrival for a while now." He grabbed my hand with a small, clammy palm and shook vigorously. "Between you and me," he whispered in a low voice, "I think it's about damn time St. Francis had a woman chief of medicine." He winked. I looked up and saw a half-dozen hospital administrators. Their number included John Stevens, who appeared years younger and healthier than when I last saw him in a casket. At this point in the history, he had not yet taken up Mr. Ringwater's work. I tightened my sphincter to keep from painting the floor with shock. "By the way," Jerry added, raising his voice to the crowd behind him, "the higher-up stated that you've just legally changed your name. I regret, but they did not notify us of your new moniker. What should we call you, Doctor?" I looked up at the glass cabinet behind the desk, and my reflection was blurry. I needed eyeglasses, thin spectacles to be precise. In another 14 years, I'd look exactly like her. "Oh, shit," I said. "Fuck my life." "Pardon me?" Jerry responded, astounded. I gave him a harsh look and narrowed my eyes. "I said Vivian Scritt. My name signifies life." He blanched slightly and swallowed. "Of course, Dr. Scritt." "I apologize." He took 2 little steps away from me. "Would you like to meet Dr. Matthews, our chief of surgery?" My mind was slowly wrapping itself around the new reality, which was both impossible and omnipresent. There was not a single trace of the real world remaining. I had dizziness as I realized how fragile the strands of our existence are, and I pondered whether dying is another way of confessing that we were never genuine. My hurting head was shaken by a sudden sense of urgency, and I had to re-clench my sphincter. "Date!" I yelled, clutching Jerry's flabby biceps firmly enough to make him wince. "What's the date today?" He stared at my palm, slack-jawed, and couldn't respond until John Stevens interrupted us. Dr. Scrit, meet our chief surgeon, Dr. Maw." "I need you to come with me right now," said a tall man in scrubs, running toward us with desperation in his eyes. "Are you officially the chief of medicine?" I was ready to look around the group for confirmation, but an invisible force drew my attention away from them and made me boldly step forward. Jerry spoke from behind me. I'm already on the clock, as are all of you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming out. Hello, Dr. Matthews. My name is Dr. Vivian Scrit. Let us walk and discuss." He embodied the essence of a man who avoided engaging in crap. This fact appealed to me, but given how scared he was, it heightened my anxiety. "Doctor, I've never seen anything like this. A school bus rolled down an embankment about 19 minutes ago. At least 13 deaths have been confirmed. The storm has shut down half of Charleston's highways. At least 6 of my surgeons cannot find a means to go to the hospital." "You're giving me a school bus full of dead children on my first day as chief of medicine?" I asked Dr. Matthews, who was pale. "Well, no, most of them are. Well, they're alive for the moment, Dr. Scrit." I closed my eyes and let the lightning bolt of a pre-migraine rip through my head, lapping at the torn gray matter like a cat, licking every drop of milk from the depths of his dish with a sandpapery tongue. For 3 seconds. Then I exhaled quietly, recognizing and appreciating the remaining anguish as a part of my mind that would help me move forward. "How far out are the first ambulances?" Dr. Matthews swallowed. "They should arrive at St. Francis within 4 minutes. The same storm that washed out the bus has shut down the Interstate 77 bridge across the Elk River, so... Are you telling me that Charleston Area Medical can't take any of the kids?" Well, that's kind of exactly what I'm saying. My headache has improved. "How many surgeries are we going to need to perform?" I asked gently. He grimaced. "We're anticipating 12 12. That storm is dreadful. Why the hell was a school bus out in the... Never mind. Let's set up this circus tent. We're severely understaffed for this crap, with hardly enough pediatric surgeons on a good day." I sighed deeply and calculated the numbers in my thoughts. Looks like a couple of interns are about to experience their first solo procedures. He nodded, turned, and dashed down the corridor. I knew where this journey was going. I was determined that this time would be different. My mind was still whirling with the reality that my entire life had been turned upside down, but I shoved the thoughts to the back of my mind. That talent is critical in a hospital. I had a bus full of dying kids to think about. I needed to be confident in Dr. Vivian Scrit's talents. I wasn't sure if that confidence came from the outside world or if I created it myself and displayed it for all to see. I was very certain that both competing beliefs were correct at the same time, and that simply believing made the thought real enough to have faith in. My head spun. I shouted at the surgical staff. "We don't have enough operating rooms in the pediatric surgical unit. These kids don't have enough doctors to get a surgeon, and I don't have the patience to put up with any donkey stuff. I'm Dr. Scrit, and you currently work for me. Dr. Matthews, how many surgeons are ready to go?" His head came to attention like if it had been snagged on a fishing line, and I felt a burst of strength as I sensed the terror emanating from him. 9, and 10 if you take a patient yourself, Dr. Scrit." He cleared his throat. "I have 4 nurses scrambling to make calls, but things aren't looking good. Most of the streets are fully flooded, and everyone who attempted to drive here has been trapped. We attempted to contact everyone we could, but but the storm knocked out the landline phones and is affecting our cell service. We are admittedly caught off surprise. It is a strange storm for August. Well, I had to stop short. What's the date? I whispered to him. It's the Thursday, August 25th. Vertigo hit me so severely that it seemed like my asshole was spinning inside out. Excuse me. I hurried out of the room and started down the hallway. Before I could return to my own workplace, I plunged into a familiar janitor's closet. I wanted to cry, but I was shaking so terribly. I looked down at my watch. My childhood home was about to burn down in an hour. My brother was still alive. Thoughts flitted across my mind like 15 border collies on crack. They need me now. Timmy needs me right now. The landlines have gone out. I am needed in surgery. Somebody is going to die. This is going to be my fault. You have 5 seconds to continue shaking and feeling sorry for yourself before you walk out the door and decide whose life will change forever. I did not believe I could do it. Then I opened the door and walked out. Dr. Matthews, it appears that we are at least 2 surgeons short. How can you help me? He looked at me steadily, but with a tinge of apprehension. I fed on it. Well, it's not ideal, but I think that we'll have to put some interns on solo procedures. He grimaced. My gut turned into clay. Who do you have in mind? Doctors Yangston and Branying have been doing very well. I closed my eyes. Who else do you have? He wouldn't say anything until I stared directly at him. Dr. Scrit. I don't know how they do things where you come from, but it's not customary for first-year interns to... Desperate times necessitate desperate, terrible tactics, Doctor. Who else do you have? His face became ashen. No one then that I could, in good conscience, trust with the life of a child. I was about to cry. There was no stopping it. Then the doors sprang open and everything changed. Game time. Orders came out of my tongue before I could think. Everyone did what I told them. Get me a phone, I shouted at one of the nurses. I looked down seconds later and discovered that I had been given one. Dr. Scrit, there are 3 more patients awaiting an OR. I grasped Dr. Matthews's arm. What are the simplest procedures that these kids need right now? He swallowed. It looks like a deep leg laceration on a male, 10 years old, and an abdominal lacerations on a female, also 10. No signs of damage to any major organs. I'm going to take one of those patients, pair Tweedledee and Tweedledum with the other, and keep them close enough to... Dr. Scrit. 3 additional youngsters are in cardiac arrest. Are you really going to... I need to make a phone call. You're needed in surgery. I'm the fucking chief of medicine. Because you're the one who's supposed to make the hardest decisions. I froze. Tears were waiting, but there wasn't time to cry. It's remarkable what happens to impossible when there isn't enough room for it. Get Yangston and Branying on the easy cases, I said, and prepare a 3rd patient for me in the operating room with them. I want to keep an eye on as many surgeries as possible. I turned to face a nurse at the desk and scribbled a phone number on a piece of paper. Call this house. Tell them to get everyone out to safety. She physically recoiled in dread. All of our landlines are down, Doctor. Well, since I'm fresh out of carrier pigeons, use a cell phone. She fought back tears. God, it was aggravating me. I can't. Why not? Because I handed you mine. I am sorry. My eyes widened. Well, doesn't anyone else at the counter have one? What is this? 2006? She grimaced. Not yet. I am sorry. Oh yes. Not wanting to appear foolish, I glared her down as if this was her fault. Then I rushed into surgery. Does anyone have a cell phone that actually gets reception? I yelled at Dr. Matthews as we hurried down the corridor. No, he gasped, falling behind me. It looks like the storm has completely cut off all cell bow reception. I didn't have time to consider whether a satellite phone was available any place in this godforsaken hospital. I was stitching up a kid's abdomen, peering at my watch and looking across the operating room at Branying and Yangston. Compartmentalize. I finished here. Nurse, take this kid to recovery. I need to make a phone call. Patient's coding. The voice came from the far end of the room. Surprisingly, it wasn't Branying or Yangston, but a young resident who I knew wouldn't make it into my initial timetable. When I hurried across the operating room, I discovered that the doctor had frozen in place. "I'm sorry," he said under his surgical mask. "I saw something in the closet. My mind isn't able to realize that you left forceps inside of the patient's arm," I shouted. When he did not move, I plunged in. Though it was unpleasant at the time, I had encountered the same hospital ghosts that this man could not manage. Nothing in front of him was impossible, but he chose to think it as an excuse for himself. This is why I have little patience with others. However, even after she had stabilized, the patient's fever remained unusually high. I also observed how bloated her abdomen was. This is why I am such a terrific doctor. Seconds later, I was doing an excellent job removing the girl's burst appendix, able to look up at Branying and Yangston, but unable to assist them. "Those figures are appropriate for an adult. Is this your first experience working on a child?" a nurse snapped at Yangston. "We performed the hemogram test. Did you even check the results?" Yangston's face flushed red against the white medical mask. "You need to get the hell out of my OR, nurse. Your patient's coding. Now, fuck." It was occurring. My own patient's appendix was in a poor state, but I was almost done. What happened?" Branying's terrified voice came from across the room. The scalpel shook in my hand. I could see the crash cart out of the corner of my eye and recognized the ID number 8251913, as I expected. "You cut his splenic artery, doctor," a nurse said frankly. "I'm sorry," Branying wailed. My hands were shaking. "I'm so sorry." "I hate church," I grumbled as I flopped onto the couch. "How do we even know that God is real?" My father ran his fingers over his thin hair. His fingernails were grimy. They were constantly dirty. "Going to church makes your pregnant mother stop nagging me for an hour every week, and that's all the proof of the divine I need," he groaned as he sat down on the couch next to me. I didn't comprehend what he was saying, so I kept a severe scowl on my face. I flinched as he attempted to hug me. Dad cleared his throat. "I didn't go to college like your mom did, so I never learned the best ways to convince people that they're wrong." He shook his head slowly. "I don't know if adults understand church any more than 6-year-olds like you do, Ellie, but many adults are old enough and wise enough to know when we should stop thinking and just go along with things." I kept my head turned aside, indicating that he was not winning me over. I could hear him scratching his head in despair. "Okay," he said, frustrated. "I'll give you my best response about church, and then you have to put your shoes on and walk out the door with me, because that's the best you can get. Do you understand?" I huffed. "I can't give you a reason why we should believe in God, Ellie. It appears that so many things in life are unjust. But here's the thing." He wrapped a strong arm over me and pulled me close. "Are you and I here together? So what was our guarantee of that? Where was the proof that my spirit and your spirit would be together, or that they existed at all? It happened somehow. God trusted in us before we existed, and 2 souls emerged where there had previously been none. So I don't think it's about us believing in God at first. God believed in us, and we are answering with everything in our life." I didn't comprehend his logic, but I sensed his sensitivity and melted into his hug. "Your mother claimed that every action has a reaction. However, I believe it is the other way around, at least when it comes to church. Every reaction results in an action. Did you know there is a prayer for it? I shook my head, pigtails bouncing. The prayer says that in giving we receive, in pardoning we are pardoned, and in dying we are born. I finally turned around and looked at him. How can we be born while dying? Isn't death the end of everything? His face twitched in strange ways that I didn't comprehend. I don't believe dying is the end. Did you aware that you have changed the lives of everyone you have ever met? And everyone they meet has changed because of them. The entire world exists exactly as it is right now, thanks to everyone who has ever lived and died. Remember what I said about the trees in West Texas? Ellie, you continue to touch people even after you die. I squirmed. So all dead people are ghosts that stay with us for the rest of our lives? My little Ellie Bean, I don't see any other explanation. I looked up at him with the awe that only a child can have for their parent. So who taught us to speak backwards to God? Where did the prayer come from? He furrowed his brow and rubbed his chin. I believe, Ellie, that it's called the Prayer of St. Francis. When my patient began to code, I could feel my mind fracturing. She was the only one time had not promised to take away from me, and it appeared that hope was only there to keep me going. I took deep breaths, stopped attempting to understand time, and focused on what was causing this girl's heart to collapse. She was losing more blood than was reasonable for an appendectomy. What went wrong? The forceps. The damn resident must have injured her arm during his hasty treatment, and she was now bleeding, possibly from her brachial artery. She was bleeding from two areas at once, and it would take a miracle to treat both problems simultaneously. However, because I did not believe in miracles, I would have to rely on myself. And I'm a damn fine doctor. I finished patching her up just in time for her to return to her normal life. Dr. Yangston was staring at the dead kid below him in stunned silence, while the nurse held Dr. Branying steady as he grieved at his own failure. The girl's heart monitor continued to pulse steadily below me. You must allow yourself room for forgiveness, Dr. Branying. Tell me you heard what I said. He rolled his red-rimmed eyes down the hallway, staring at everything except me. Confirm that you hear me. It's a basic request that even children who haven't learned the fine art of toilet usage can handle. Dr. Branying. He slowly focused on me. I think I need to go be alone, he said distractedly. I knew how this narrative would finish. I know you're in a difficult situation, but I can't watch you every second. Dr. Branying, you must first take responsibility for your own well-being. You should avoid being alone the next day. He eventually found my eyes. You're correct, Dr. Scrit. I am responsible for myself. It's entirely on me. All of it, he deflated. You can't keep me back indefinitely. Please let me go. I wanted to shake him, scream at him, and tell him I knew exactly what he was going to do. Most of all, I wanted to smack the hell out of him. But he was correct. I couldn't keep him back indefinitely. I checked his pockets for illegal medications but discovered none. What more could I do? I had a telephone call to make. Dr. Branying, I want you to remember something, I said with firmness. He glanced at me dejectedly. If you insist on being so damn melancholy over the things you can't change, then step up and take responsibility for the things that you can. Then I turned and bolted. I took out my cell phone and tried to dial while going at full speed. The call went through. No one picked up. You've reached the Afeles home, but we're gone. I came to a standstill in front of a familiar-looking janitor who emerged from a well-used closet. He held up a soft hand with dirty fingernails, signaling that I should stop. I obeyed. He grinned sadly. If you'd run to Huntington Bank across the street, you could have used their phone in time. He exhaled. But I'm sorry, it's too late. Your house has burned down." I turned and went dazedly away. The last 26 years of my existence had been stolen away only for this moment, which I had squandered. No, it was not true. The remainder of my life had been taken away because it would be impossible to pick up the threads of my previous existence by the time I returned in 2013. That terrible fire had consumed everything in my life, just as it had Timmy's. It was too much. I was breaking. I turned around, dove into the janitor's closet, and totally lost it. I didn't care who heard. All I wanted was to know that no one could touch me and that I would be utterly alone while I broke down and ugly wept my hope away. I had no desire to live after that moment. The thought of existence was too terrible. Everything was over. I wanted my story to end. Eventually, I stopped crying. I was honestly astonished to learn that the story continued. I was so preoccupied with where and when I was that my imagination couldn't conceive of a hereafter. Therefore, I thought there was none. Time, it appears, had no regard for what I imagined. So, with nothing else on my script, I rose up, walked out the door, and continued to be the head of medicine. "Your doctors suck ass," the small girl told me as I examined her bandages. "Your language sucks ass, young lady," I said, replacing the gauze. It was healing perfectly. I'd removed her appendix and it was flawless. So why the heck did he leave forceps in me then? I'm only 12 years old, and even I understand that there was no purpose to utilize that type of machinery when my arm had just been amputated. I raised an eyebrow. Something about her frizzy hair, dark brown eyes, and edginess felt familiar. "So you think you could do a better job in my operating room, kid?" She shrugged. "The bar's pretty low," I snorted. "You survived a ruptured appendix." "You are welcome." The girl nodded flippantly. "Yes, but it is your job. A better job would have been to identify the problem before it became so severe." I dropped my hands to my hips in frustration. "You think you've got this figured out?" "Yeah," she answered casually. "Well, one day I will." "You want to be a doctor?" I shot back. "Maybe," she said, looking at her arm rather than at me, "but certainly a nurse. Doctors are simply nurses who grow bored of getting their hands dirty." For the first time in recent memory, I giggled, then looked down to see her chart again. I glanced back at her. "Lydia? That is my name." "The same information has been on your page the entire time." "You," she said. "See, that is what I mean. You must pay attention to what is happening before time runs out." When she appeared in 2019, I decided to be good to myself. Young Ellie had gone through a lot. I saw her for the first time while she was eating lunch with the other new recruits. I had expected a mystical experience, but all I could think about was how much I missed being able to glide across the room without splitting my hips. She sat down next to Dr. Myron Caldwell, who swiftly snatched her sandwich, ate it, and put it out of reach. Ellie's face fell. Then she rose up, moved around the table, and grabbed her own meal. Dr. Caldwell summoned Dr. Hassenfuss, who was unquestionably the most attractive of the new class, and motioned for her to sit near him. Ellie looked around to discover her seat had been taken. She dried her eyes and went down at a different table to eat her lunch, completely alone. My stomach sank. What a fucking wuss. I had completely forgotten about that moment and felt like I was seeing a stranger. Was this indeed the class of 2019? I'd previously worked wonders with idiots, but there was a limit, even for doctors as talented as me. How was I expected to motivate this class? I can mold clay but not feces, so what was I going to do with Ellie? "I don't have time to get to know you," I told the gathering group, "so make yourselves stand out in some notable way and I won't have to worry about it." See, I may be warm and supportive. I glanced around at my honorable company. Dr. Falhar had a full knuckle up his nose. Dr. Brutzen was laughing to himself and staring at me. And Dr. Caldwell reached out to pinch Dr. Hazenfuss's ass. She squealed, became red, and smiled at him. For fuck's sake, we had just gotten out of pediatric surgery, and the slapdick squad was acting as if their work ended when they clock out. I huffed. These people and the patients they were half a suture away from murdering were fortunate to receive my caring supervision. 19 of you start today, and we've got a pool going with bets on how long each of you will last, I announced to get their attention. Don't feel any pressure, everyone. I've spoken with every one of you privately, and my expectations are quite low. I stifled a grin as I glanced over my stunned charges, snorted, and turned to walk away. They paused. My stomach fell as I saw they lacked respect. God damn, things had to improve immediately. You should know when to follow me and when to stay away, because I'm not going to waste time explaining what you should figure out on your own, I told them when I called. They immediately caught up. As we rounded the corner, I glanced around to see Ellie elbowed to the back of the line. She was willing to take the abuse. It was evident that she was not on any road that would lead to becoming chief of medicine. She did not appear to be capable of handling the responsibilities of a doctor. By the end of the week, St. Francis would have crushed this feeble little butterfly. My hands shook. Was this girl going to shatter space-time because she couldn't handle human contact? My thoughts raced. I never played favorites, but my time at St. Francis had trained me to take any message the hospital sent my way. It expected things from me, but provided me tools in exchange. I just hadn't considered how severely I'd need them on day one. Hell, I hadn't considered the list of rules issue until a couple folks dropped out. Every year, on a random day, the mysterious stack of papers appeared on my desk. I knew not to look at them. Instead, I would gather them and distribute them, confident that each list would be directed to the appropriate individual. I had almost forgotten they had arrived so early in 2019, but as I walked down the corridor, I felt my pockets suddenly become heavy with a stack of papers. I grabbed the sheets and pushed them behind me without saying anything. "Take one and pass it on, Dr. Endelman," I said offhandedly. I allowed the group a moment to return them, knowing that Ellie would be the only person denied a paper because she was last in line, and she was a wuss. "You should have the list of expectations for St. Francis," I explained as I moved on, knowing Ellie would be concerned without even looking back. "I printed 18 sets of rules so that you would have to challenge one another for them, knowing that one of you would be left behind." It was hard, even for me. But I knew Ellie's capabilities, so I had to bitch-slap her weakness away right now. "If you do not follow these regulations, there will be no place for you in this hospital. It is very likely that you are not qualified to be a doctor and should pursue a career that requires less mental aptitude." I paused and glanced around as if I were interested in the group, but all I needed to do was watch Ellie. I'd seen the rest a long time ago, and the person we see the least is ourselves. I noticed grief in her. One more tiny fracture appeared in the kaleidoscope of fissures that spiderwebbed across my consciousness as I sensed Timmy instinctively in the back of her mind. Compartmentalize. And if you think that I'm the type to give second chances after a mistake, you're woefully underprepared for the world of medicine. I looked at each one in turn, hoping that my lesson had been absorbed. Ellie still looked terrified. Dr. Fahlar was still digging for that recalcitrant snot. Why are so many slackers aspiring to be professionals? Shoveling elephant excrement at the zoo is a perfectly important career, and life would be a lot easier if individuals had the decency to be open about their future plans. I waited for them to take some initiative. Caldwell, despite being a douche, had graduated from Johns Hopkins in the top 10% of his class. Were they all going to stare at me in mindless nihilism? Several unmanaged heart rate monitors beeped behind me, demanding my attention. "Well," I exclaimed in frustration, Why are you standing here? People are dying. Get to work. I didn't feel horrible about Dr. Caldwell's scream. The hospital had just cleansed one guy in exchange for sparing those he would have killed in the coming years, owing to his inadequacies. I watched the action occur from across the hall. Dr. Matthews was horrified as he dashed inside the room, but the familiar janitor nodded calmly and swept past me, closing the door behind him. Dr. Caldwell was about to die. Many years ago, my mind learned to accept what it couldn't change. My heart was reluctant to adapt, but it became more calloused with each day. I did not follow the janitor as he opened the door and wheeled Dr. Caldwell away on a trolley. Instead, I concentrated my efforts on Ellie as she walked out of the room a few moments later, assuming she was being subtle. Of course, her bright crimson face was as obvious as a sledgehammer to the testicles. She was completely out of her comfort zone. I smiled. Time travel is the most perplexing thing until it is replaced with an even stranger reality. You learn to accept it, as people do with all everyday wonders, until the amazing pervades our lives to the point that it becomes mundane. Humans did the same thing the day after the airplane, rocket ship, and smartphone were released on an unsuspecting species. They got up, and headed to work as usual. So did I, as did the younger version of me. She was at least seeming to be working before I discovered her hiding in the closet, reading a list of stolen regulations, and looked guiltier than a teen guy caught sucking a toy teddy bear. "Dr. Aphalis," I said, barely concealing my grin. "I'm shocked." I looked down at the blood-stained list of regulations in her hand. Her mouth flopped around, but her nervousness prevented her from mastering the voice-to-words notion. You took a list that wasn't yours and were nowhere to be found after your coworker experienced such an unnatural incident. I huffed through my nose. It appears like you're willing to go to extreme lengths to obtain what you need. And Myron couldn't even obey the most fundamental rule. She clenched her teeth. I had a 4-year trend of guessing which incoming doctors would break the most quickly. This will ruin my chances in the office pool. She bought the narrative since it was so simple to lie to her, and I had to turn back before she noticed me burst into a full smile. "Go to work, doctor. You have 3 hours left on your shift, and those symptoms aren't going to Google themselves." I learned early on that surgery is painful, but it heals. This unfortunate girl suffered from crippling self-doubt, and no anesthesia could be administered after its removal. But that girl needed all the confidence she could get if she was going to survive the next years, and I cared too much to deny her the finest treatment possible, even if the short-term cost felt terrifying. I regarded our little talk to be a success. Furthermore, she would get over it. I was certain. Years have passed. Every day hurts a little more because I can't stop thinking about what I'd do if I could go back. And I know I'd probably still make the same decision. That was the moment. I could feel one of the largest surviving shards of my burnt heart crack and fall away. I turned away because I couldn't afford to show her my pain. Not now. Not after all. "Ellie," I said with a laugh, "why do you think that St. Francis Hospital would have such an arbitrary set of rules for its interns?" "The rules come from somewhere beyond us," she said calmly. "I understand now. We're only here to follow them. This girl had come a long way. I was the one holding back tears." I shook my head as a distraction. "No, Dr. Aphalis, that is not true." I wiped my tears, desperately seeking self-control. "What was the first rule?" Her response was emotionless. "Never, under any circumstances, share your copy of the rules with anyone else." I looked at her with calm and concentrated eyes and raised an eyebrow. "And how does that make any sense?" I felt a surge of smugness as I saw her stumble. "You, It was important to see not all of us were going to make it. That much is true, I replied dismissively. We've seen plenty of proof of that tonight, but you are mistaken about the rule coming from somewhere else. I stared into her eyes. She was speechless. I don't understand. Then you're starting to get it, I replied, resuming my haughty demeanor. You weren't top of your class, Dr. Aphelis, not even close, but you're intelligent enough to be a doctor. Can you try to work this out? She said nothing. It was a planned action which I admired. I shook my head to hide my pride in her. Then I took the leap. Did you truly never make those connections, Dr. Aphelis? The trial of jumping from a roof? A judgment from an authoritative janitor? Multiple separate rules for burning children? Her jaw fell. The first rule forbids the sharing of rules because no one has the same set. Each doctor faces his or her own set of constraints, and most aren't up to the task. Her lips opened and closed 3 times before she could formulate an answer. Every rule is just for me? I removed my glasses and stared into her eyes. People think that this hospital wants to destroy them, when in reality, each person is given every tool needed for survival. I snorted. It's impossible to stop most individuals' desire to kill themselves. She endeavored, but failed to connect the dots. But, Rule 4, why did it tell me not to touch your Reese's peanut butter cups? She nearly figured it out, almost. Nonetheless, I hid the truth. Because it's my favorite candy, she nodded slowly. Mine too. I waited half a second longer, hoping she'd finally see the truth and break the pattern. But it wasn't to be. I put my spectacles back on and exposed everything I could. You are going to inquire what this place is. I've been with St. Francis longer than most. That is why people expect me to inform them. I waited patiently, carefully selecting my next words. So, before you say that you want me to tell you the truth, you should understand this fact. I stared at her till she turned away again. It is critical for me to have the upper hand. There are things I cannot and do not know. Embracing these beliefs as a strength rather than a weakness has allowed me to persevere where others have failed. The quiet indicated that she only comprehended some of what I had said. None of it, and some of everything. Such is the state of being an enlightened physician. Can you see the individual rules on each doctor's paper? She inquired, breaking the stillness. I smiled. It was true that other doctors had their own unique set of regulations, but she didn't understand them. No, but I can see what is written on their faces, and it is the same thing. I don't get it, she responded plainly. I sighed with disappointment and threw her one more bone. Do you remember when I reminded you of Rule 9? Her thoughts raced with the dumb brilliance of rote memorization. You told me that the morgue needed 13 cadavers at all times, she replied confidently. No, I lied. You told me that. I pretended to know everything all along, and you responded to my confidence. Each person's set of rules represents their own struggle to fight. To be candid, I'd rather see doctors fail themselves due to incompetence than see patients suffer because someone couldn't live up to their own unwarranted arrogance. She blinked. I'd like to earn my arrogance. I liked that response. I enjoyed it a lot. The good news is that I think you might have the endurance to survive the unusually lengthy journey it would take for you to achieve earned arrogance. My heart sank with pride at the unknown road. The door burst open with an unanticipated emergency that defines a physician's daily routine, and we moved on. She never asked how I knew that jumping off a roof, being judged by an authoritarian janitor, or the critical importance of burning children constituted her existence. She didn't ask why I knew what the regulations were in the first place. The truth was there in plain sight, but it went ignored until the second time around. Had it not been obvious? The next big change was approaching. It permeated my thoughts like damp air whispering of an impending storm. I thought I was prepared for it, which demonstrated that certain lessons are never learnt. I'd been silently following Ellie down the same hallway that had pulled me in years before. On this particular day, however, she only saw a familiar janitor wandering its walls. We'd seen him several times over the years, rarely chatting and never raging. This time he addressed her directly. "It's time to make a choice, Ellie," he said softly. "The most successful people are frequently seen as a distinct breed, reaching tremendous heights due to their unique makeup. Dr. Aphalis disproved this by soaking her pants, while perhaps the most important moment of her life unfolded. She didn't think she was ready to be chief of medicine, so now was the time to get started." The janitor stepped back and peered at a space in the wall that had only sometimes housed a physical door. It remained there, slightly ajar. The numbers were deeply engraved in the wood, twisted and weathered as if they had been there for years. "Why does it say 3191? She asked. He grinned sadly. "It's your opportunity to go backward." She was weak, thus this was the best time for her to gain strength. "Where does it lead?" she questioned, her voice cracking. "Rural Missouri," he said unwaveringly, "far from any town. About 30 minutes from Drisking." He lifted his eyebrows. "But that's not the real question now, is it?" She closed her eyes. "When does it lead?" He waited until she was strong enough to make eye contact before continuing. "August 25th, 2005. She started crying. "Can it go any earlier?" "No," he said firmly. "I'd have very little time to prepare." "The world turns on what people do with very little." She dried her eyes and decided whether she would be powerful or weak. "Okay," she said, her voice cracking. "I need to go back." She inhaled deeply. "I can get ready in a few days. Where can I find the door?" The janitor stood still. "Right here, right now." She flirted with vulnerability. No, I'm not ready right now. I need to be ready if my life is going to change." She was losing the battle for herself, having already lost the "don't look like a mucousy mess" competition. He folded his hands firmly. "If you don't go now, the door will disappear. You will never see it again." She collapsed into a kneeling position. Though I was confident that she was ready to take over as chief of medicine, I was displeased at the moment. "Okay," she whimpered. "Okay, I'll go now." She looked up. "When I come back, will the world be different?" He was extremely silent. Afterward, "You can only come back the hard way, Ellie." That's when I first noticed the tears on my own face. That was 26 years ago. I can't lose that much of my life. He exhaled. "Yes, you can. People lose that much every day." I covered my mouth to hide my sobs. "Will," she stammered, "I do not understand. Is my body going to reverse its age, or will I look like this and die 26 years earlier?" I heaved, overcome by intense silent tears, scarcely able to remain silent. "You don't get any extra time, Ellie," he said in his forceful tone. "Any year that you live twice takes away from what would have been." He looked over at me and made straight eye contact. For the first time, he appeared overly demanding of obedience. But he didn't tell her I was there. She gave a dry heave. "But," I screamed, "will it be like the last time I went back? Will I be able to modify things now?" He smiled. I wasn't sure whether the expression was sad because it was happy or happy because it was sad. "The past will be yours to change as you like. Your choices will change the world." She looked up, suddenly feeling confident. I dissolved upon the floor. "Ellie," he whispered, "you always knew that last part was true, right?" She eventually sobbed loudly. I took advantage of the opportunity to let my own tears overlap with hers. For a little period, they matched wonderfully. She leaned forward and pressed her hands to the ground. I need time to process this. You don't have time and don't need it. Right now, you have to walk through that door or leave forever. He reached out, grabbed the knob, and started pulling it close. We want to assume that important judgments take time because it permits us to imagine that profound contemplation alters our most primal instincts. However, we are our most authentic selves in brief times of high consequence. She sprang up and squeezed through the door just as he shut it behind her. When he instantly pulled it open again, there was no one on the other end. We were alone. For the first time in 26 years, there were no two of me in the world, traveling parallel tracks on a journey that was neither predetermined nor created by our decisions. "You almost broke the moment," he murmured, gazing at the wooden frame. He then turned to face me. She was the stronger one today. I glanced up at him with the end of the story in sight and wondered whether I had truly hoped that the final scene would be more wonderful than this. "It doesn't matter," I retorted. "It's done now." I looked away, wiped the tears and snot from my wrist, and walked past him. "It matters, Ellie, and it's never finished." I was relieved to be facing away from him since I discovered that there were still tears in reserve. Every person you failed and every person you saved don't get to walk away from what you did here each day for 26 years. I tried unsuccessfully to sniff all of the snot off my upper lip back into my nose. Well, my story can be done for better or worse or whatever. "Is that the side of the door you're choosing?" There was something in his voice that I couldn't identify. It made my chest feel somewhere between hope and terror, which I didn't enjoy. I slowly turned around to look at him. The door was still ajar. "Where does that door—" Not the right question. "When does that door—" Please don't ask questions to which you already know the answers. The area between us was frozen with crystalline energy that was both beautiful and dangerous. I am an old woman. My story is finished. He shakes his head. "Stories do not end," he said, lips pushed together. "Not when there are people still living the effects of what's been written and unwritten." When I spoke again, my voice was brittle and ready to splinter at its weakest points. I attempted to fight time. "It took my entire life." I took a big, nervous breath. "I have nothing left to show for it." "You have your whole life to show for it," he stated firmly. "Each day will be lived. It makes no difference whether you spend it in regret or happiness. Time passes. A prior decision cannot take your life as long as you are breathing." Another frozen moment occurred. Then it passed. "I'm 64 years old," I said wearily. "It's time for me to retire." I turned away from the janitor and the door and started walking. "Wait." I came to a stop but did not turn back. "You didn't close the door." I remained facing away from him. There isn't always a clear distinction between good and weak options. Sometimes just making a decision is a sign of strength. "Well then," he said with a tinge of urgency, "what are you going to do about this door?" I halted. Then I walked out of room 3191, but did not close the door behind me, and went down the corridor to a location where I suspected I was needed. Emergencies had a way of locating me. If you don't let go of the past, it will never leave you.